They told him choosing her would destroy him. They were right, just not in the way anyone expected. In a hall full of beautiful women fighting to be chosen, the most feared alpha king in the northern frontier walked past every single one of them. He stopped in front of a cloaked figure no one wanted, a woman whose own father was hoping to sell her into slavery before sundown. A woman rumored to be cursed, scarred, and broken beyond repair. And in front of hundreds of witnesses, he said 4 words that would change everything. I choose her. What happened next would shatter a 1,000-year-old curse, bring a kingdom to its knees, and prove that the most dangerous thing in the wild northern territories was never a wolf, never a warlord. It was a woman they tried to bury. Welcome. Stay until the end. Hit that like button, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The Mating Auction of Veldmoor was not a place where hope lived. It was a place where hope came to be priced, appraised, and sold. Every year when the frost crept down from the Iron Fang Mountains and the great wolves of the northern frontier gathered beneath the banners of their packs, the auction halls of Veldmoor opened their iron doors. And inside those doors, women without mates, without protectors, without futures, stood on raised platforms beneath torchlight and waited to be chosen. The kingdom called it tradition. Most of the women inside those walls called it something else entirely. The main auction hall was a vast, vaulted chamber of black stone, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with the mounted pelts of beasts long dead. Hundreds of candles dripped from iron chandeliers overhead, casting everything in a flickering amber glow that made the whole scene look like something out of a fever dream. The air smelled of tallow smoke, pine resin, and the faint, unmistakable musk of dominant wolves asserting their rank simply by breathing. The crowd was enormous tonight. Alphas and their seconds filled the floor in clusters, dressed in the heavy furs and armor of their respective territories. There were wolves from the Ashvale Ridges to the east, their faces tattooed with hunting marks. There were lords from the Greywood settlements, their cloaks pinned with silver wolf head clasps. There were minor pack leaders from a dozen other frontier territories, each of them accompanied by advisors, betas, and the occasional nervous omega carrying messages. And then, seated in the raised gallery above it all, were the women. 32 of them tonight. Some sat straight-backed and composed, wearing their finest available garments, their hair carefully arranged, their faces schooled into pleasant expressions that had probably taken years of pain to perfect. Others wept silently, keeping their eyes fixed on the floor. A few, the younger ones, still hadn't entirely understood what was happening. They kept looking toward the doors as if expecting someone to walk through them and announce that this was all a terrible mistake. No one was coming through those doors for them. Leora Vale understood this better than most. She sat at the far end of the gallery, separated from the others by a deliberate gap of 3 empty seats, as if proximity to her might be contagious. She wore a cloak of undyed wool, rough, heavy, formless, that fell from her shoulders to her feet and covered every inch of her. The hood was pulled so far forward that from most angles she appeared to have no face at all, just a shadow where a face should be. The women nearest her kept stealing glances at that shadow. Then they would look away. They didn't know what was under the hood. Nobody did, not with certainty. But the whispers had been circulating for 3 days, ever since the Veldmoor auction master had registered her name on the auction list and noted, in small, nervous handwriting, the word restricted next to her entry. Restricted meant that whoever purchased her could not demand to see her face before the contract was signed. Restricted was, in the language of Veldmoor's auction house, essentially a warning. The whispers that followed were predictable. Some said the cloak hid burns that covered half her body. Others said she had been marked by a curse so visible that looking at it directly caused madness. One of the auction master's assistants had murmured to a buyer that he'd glimpsed a brand on the back of her hand. A brand that looked unmistakably like flame. That particular whisper had traveled fastest of all. Because in the northern frontier kingdoms, fire witches were not a myth. They were a memory, a living one, raw and ugly, the kind that communities passed down the way they passed down trauma. Through their teeth, in quiet voices, in stories told to children who asked too many questions. Fire witches had once been among the most powerful creatures the frontier had ever produced. And 40 years ago, they had been systematically hunted, bound, and destroyed. Any woman marked as one, even if the mark was theoretical, even if it was second-hand and unverified, was essentially unsellable. Lyora knew this. She had known it for 6 years. She had also known, with the kind of quiet, painful clarity that only the repeatedly humiliated ever truly develop, that her father knew it too. Edron Vale was standing near the back of the auction hall, speaking in low tones with one of the auction house brokers. He was a heavy-set man with the blunt, wide face of someone who had once been powerful and was now running on the fumes of that former power. His pack, the Vale pack of the Southern Ridges, had collapsed 3 years ago. Bad alliances, worse investments, and a stubborn refusal to adapt to the shifting trade routes that had slowly strangled the old frontier economy. What remained of his holdings was leveraged against loans he couldn't repay. What remained of his family was one unmarried daughter he'd been trying to offload for years. "She's 24, he was saying to the broker, his voice carefully casual. "Healthy, intelligent, not too much so. Knows how to run a household, doesn't talk back." The broker, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the permanently anxious expression of someone who had learned to anticipate disaster, glanced up toward the gallery and then quickly away. "The restriction on her file is precautionary," Edron said smoothly. "Rumor. You know how people talk." The mark on her hand, a birthmark. Edron. The broker's voice dropped to something barely audible. The last 2 buyers who expressed interest both withdrew after they heard the Fire Witch rumors. "If no one claims her tonight, then she goes to the labor contracts." Edron's expression didn't change. "Which is what happens. I understand the process." The broker looked at him for a moment. "Labor contracts for women with restricted files aren't domestic work, Edron. You know what kind of contracts those are." Edron Vale picked up his drink and turned his gaze to the auction floor. "I know," he said. He said nothing else. Tit. Lyora could hear the crowd below without being able to see most of it. She had spent the last hour studying the shoes of the women nearest her, and the grain of the wooden platform beneath her feet, and the precise way the candlelight caught the smoke that drifted up from the chandeliers. She had become, over the course of 6 years, very good at studying small things. It was a skill she had developed deliberately, because it kept her from spending too much time studying the large things, the shape of her life, the walls of the room she'd been locked in for most of her adolescence, the face of her father explaining to her, with calm and reasonable precision, why she couldn't attend pack gatherings, couldn't be seen at markets, couldn't meet the sons of other families. Because she was a problem, he'd told her, a liability, something to be managed. She had believed him for a while. Most people believe the stories they're told about themselves when they have nothing else to go on. Then she had started asking questions. That was when the room had gotten smaller. The auction master's voice rose from below, beginning the formal proceedings in the elaborate, archaic language that the auction house still used out of stubborn tradition. Lyora listened to the cadence of it without processing the words. She had already read the contract. She understood her situation with complete clarity. If no alpha claimed her tonight, her restricted file would be passed to the labor contract office. Labor contracts for women in her category were essentially indentured arrangements. She would be assigned to whatever operation agreed to take on the liability of a restricted candidate. Mining operations in the Greywood, timber camps in the deep frontier, places where names didn't matter and faces even less. Her father would receive a small fee for the contract transfer. She would disappear. The thought didn't produce panic in her anymore. It had, once. Now it produced something colder and more deliberate. A refusal. A quiet, iron-hard private refusal that she had never said out loud because there had never been anyone worth saying it to. "I will not disappear." She didn't know exactly what that meant yet. She had no plan beyond surviving tonight, but the refusal was real, and she held on to it like a coal held in a fist, painful, burning, impossible to drop. The main auction had been running for 40 minutes when the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Not the main entrance doors. The side entrance, the one reserved for late arrivals of significant rank, the kind of entrance that had its own antechamber and its own set of guards and its own unspoken language of consequence. The room didn't go quiet immediately. It went quiet in waves, starting at the back near the doors and rolling forward through the crowd the way a stone dropped in still water sends its ripples outward. By the time the wave reached the front of the hall, it had taken almost every conversation in the room with it. Leora felt the silence before she understood its cause. Then she heard the whispers begin, and the whispers told her everything. Draven, the Alpha King, he's here. Kael Draven was 31 years old, and he had been Alpha King of the Northern Territories for 9 years. 9 years was, by the historical standards of the northern frontier, an extraordinarily long reign for an unmated king. The frontier was not kind to unmated alphas in positions of power. The pack structure required heirs, required visible continuity, required the kind of political alliance that only mating contracts could provide. Every year Kael remained unmated was a year his advisors spent circulating increasingly alarmed memoranda about succession, about pack loyalty, about the fragility of a kingdom without a queen. He had ignored every single one of these memoranda. He had also, in 9 years, rejected every formal mating proposal his court had placed before him, and the count of those proposals was now somewhere north of 40. He'd rejected daughters of territorial lords, daughters of allied packs, daughters of trade families whose support he needed and whose patriarchs had offered the rejections back with gritted teeth and carefully maintained smiles. He rejected them all without cruelty and without explanation. The court had theories. The court always had theories. The most popular one, spoken in the quietest corners of the most trusted private rooms, was the curse. Every king of the Draven line lived under it. It was old enough that most people treated it as legend rather than fact, the way civilizations tend to treat inconvenient truths when acknowledging them directly would require too much rearrangement of everything else. But the court historians knew its shape, the Draven curse, laid by a paranoid ancestor onto every king of his bloodline, declared that any king who fell in love would be destroyed by it. Ice, the old text said. A freezing from within, a frost that spread from the heart outward until it consumed the body entirely. Kael Draven did not speak about the curse publicly. He did not need to. The way he moved through the world, controlled, precise, deliberately cold, spoke for him. He was a king who had chosen to eliminate the possibility of the danger entirely. No closeness, no tenderness, no love. He walked into the Veldmoor auction hall like a man entering a battlefield he'd already mapped. He was taller than most of the alphas in the room, which was saying something, given that the northern frontier did not produce small men. He wore black, traveling clothes, not ceremonial, which told everyone in the room that this visit was unplanned or at least unannounced. No crown, just a silver signet ring on his right hand and the kind of authority that doesn't require ornamentation. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides, and his face was the kind of face that made artists want to paint it and enemies want to avoid it, strong-boned, expressionless, with eyes the color of winter ice. He had 2 guards with him, just 2, because the Alpha King of the Northern Territories had nothing to prove. His advisor, a wiry, perpetually sweating man named Corvin who had been with him for 7 years and still occasionally looked surprised to still be alive, was half a step behind him, speaking in urgent, low tones that Kael was visibly and completely ignoring. "My lord, this was not on the schedule. I know. The court will have questions. They always do. If you're seen here, the implications—" Corvan. Kael's voice was flat, not unkind, but possessing the particular quality of a door being firmly closed. "I didn't ask for commentary." Corvan closed his mouth. He had learned to recognize that tone. Kael moved through the crowd, which parted for him the way water parts for a stone dropped into it. Immediately, completely, with a kind of stunned, reflexive respect that had nothing to do with conscious choice. Alphas who had been arguing over contract terms stopped arguing. The auction master, mid-presentation, faltered visibly, then recovered and began the elaborate formal greeting that protocol required. Kael waved it aside. He was looking at the gallery. He moved along the edge of the auction floor, his gaze traveling slowly along the row of women seated above. It was an assessment, not unkind, but clinical, the way a commander assesses terrain. The women he looked at either straightened hopefully or looked away. Several of the territorial lords in the crowd were already exchanging glances. calculating the political mathematics of an alliance with whoever the king chose. He was 2/3 of the way down the gallery when he stopped. He had reached the gap, the 3 empty seats, and beyond them, at the end of the row, the figure in the undyed wool cloak, the shadow where a face should be. He stopped. Something in the crowd shifted. The whispers changed register. Corvan, appearing at his elbow, leaned in and said very quietly, "My lord, her file is restricted." "I know. There are rumors about what she might be." "I heard them." "The other women?" "Corvan." Cale was still looking at the hooded figure. His expression had not changed. "How many times do I need to close this conversation?" The silence that followed was Corvan wisely choosing his continued employment over his current opinion. Cale moved to stand directly in front of the gallery rail, directly opposite the cloaked woman at the end of the row. He looked at the hood for a long moment. From inside it, he could see absolutely nothing. Not a chin, not a jaw, not even the suggestion of a face. Just darkness. He looked at the hands. They were folded in her lap, one gloved, one bare. On the bare hand, on the back, where the wrist met the knuckle, he could see the very edge of a mark. It was partially visible, the curved base of something that could be a brand or a birthmark or a scar. In the candlelight, its color was ambiguous. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the hood. The hall was almost completely silent now. Every conversation had died. Every transaction had paused. 300 people were watching the Alpha King of the Northern Territories stand in front of the most unmarketable candidate in the room and do nothing, which was somehow more alarming than anything else he might have done. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, not a proclamation, almost a statement to himself that happened to be audible. "I choose her." The eruption that followed was not elegant. 3 territorial lords began talking simultaneously, their voices climbing over each other in an uncoordinated cacophony of objection, question, and barely concealed alarm. The auction master stood with his gavel raised and his mouth open, processing input his training had not prepared him for. Half the crowd was on their feet. The other half was craning to see better. In the gallery, the women nearest Leora had all leaned as far away from her as their seats allowed, as if the king's attention were a fire that might spread. Leora herself had gone absolutely still. She had heard the words, she had understood them. She was still in the process of believing them. Idron Vale had pushed to the front of the crowd near the auction floor. His face was flushed, and the expression on it was complicated. Surprise, certainly, but beneath the surprise, something calculating was already running. If the Alpha King was claiming his daughter, the price would be significant. The political capital alone. "The restriction on her file," Idron called out, his voice carefully pitched to sound like concern rather than greed. "Your Grace should be made aware." "I'm aware of everything relevant," Kyle said without turning around. Something about the way he said it, the absolute unembellished certainty, dropped another layer of silence over the room. Corvan leaned in one final time. "My lord, I must formally advise, your advice is noted." Kyle finally turned from the gallery. His voice hadn't risen once. "Start the paperwork up." The contract room was a small chamber off the main hall, furnished with a long table, oil lamps, and the perpetual quiet anxiety of the auction house broker who had drawn the assignment of managing this particular transaction. He laid the documents out with hands that were not quite steady. Leora sat on one side of the table. Kyle sat on the other. This was the first time they had been in the same room at less than gallery distance, and the reality of him, the size, the stillness, the absolute absence of social performance, was different from what she'd anticipated. She had expected coldness. What she found instead was something more like precision. He was not cold the way frost was cold. He was cold the way a blade was cold, functional, intentional, without waste. He looked at the broker. "Leave the room." The broker left the room with the speed of a man who had never been more relieved by an instruction in his life. In the silence, Kyle placed 3 fingers on the contract documents and slid them to one side. He looked at Leora. She could see his eyes from within the shadow of her hood. That pale winter ice color, direct and without evasion. "I'm going to tell you the terms I want," he said. "Not the standard contract, my terms. and then you'll decide." She said nothing. She was listening in the specific, total way she'd developed over years of gathering information in environments where information was the only currency she had. "You'll come to Ironspire as my queen," he said. "You'll have a title, a household staff, full access to the palace and its resources. You'll be protected, not by contract clause, but by my actual authority, which is considerable. No one will touch you." He paused. His expression remained entirely neutral, as if he were reading terms off a page he'd memorized. "In return, you will be available for mating. I need heirs. That's not optional." He said it without any of the usual pretense. No euphemism, no softening, just fact. "There's one additional condition that is non-negotiable." "Your face," Leora said. It was the first thing she'd said since he'd chosen her. Her voice was steady. She'd had 6 years of practice keeping her voice steady. Kyle looked at her for a moment. Something shifted briefly in his expression, too fast to name. "Your face," he confirmed. "I won't see it. That condition is permanent. If you agree to it, it's final." The silence stretched. Outside the room, she could hear the muffled chaos of the hall. Voices, movement, the kind of noise that significant events generated. Her father's voice was probably in there somewhere, already negotiating his fee. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her. "Why what?" "Why me?" She kept her voice even. "There were 31 other women in that gallery. Most of them would have agreed to your terms without a private meeting. Most of them would have considered this a rescue. Why not take the straightforward option?" Something that might, in a different face, have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. It didn't complete itself. "I don't make decisions based on what's straightforward," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Another silence. She turned the choice over in the space behind her eyes, examining it from every angle. The alternatives were labor contracts and disappearance. The alternative to the alternative was a palace, a title, a protection that came from the most formidable authority in the Northern Territories, and a man who had walked past every easier option in the room to stand in front of her, and who was now sitting across from her in a private room and giving her the courtesy of actual terms rather than simple possession. It was not nothing. "One condition of my own," she said. Cale waited. "The restriction on my file stays. Whatever the rumors say I am, you don't ask, you don't investigate. You take me as I am, or you don't take me at all." He studied her for a moment. "That's a significant ask." "Your condition was also significant." The almost smile again. This time it lasted a fraction of a second longer. "Fair," he said. He picked up the pen and signed the documents. In the main hall, Idron Vale was completing his portion of the paperwork with the focused attention of a man doing mathematics in his head. The fee was generous, more than generous. The Alpha King's representative had named a number that would clear most of his debts with enough left over to rebuild something resembling a foundation. He signed his name. He took the sealed envelope. He did not ask how Leora was doing. He did not look toward the contract room. He had managed this situation exactly as intended, and the outcome was the best possible one. He would not think about her again. Leora did not know this yet, but she had learned gradually and with great effort not to expect anything different. The knowledge had been painful once. Now it was simply a fact, the way the cold was a fact, the way the auction had been a fact, real, hard-edged, not requiring her emotions to be real. She walked out of the contract room as Queen Consort of the Northern Territories. She still had not removed her hood. The carriage that carried them north was large, warm, and absolutely silent. Corvan had ridden ahead with the guards. Kyle sat across from Leora in the interior, and for the first hour of travel, neither of them said anything. He read documents by the window lamp. She watched the frontier landscape begin to shift outside the glass, the scrubby southern lowlands giving way gradually to the harder, more vertical terrain of the northern approach, where the tree line thickened and the sky darkened and the mountains began to impose themselves on the horizon. It was Kyle who broke the silence. "What do you know about Ironspire?" "Enough," she said. "The palace is carved into the base of the Iron Fang Range. The city sits in the valley below it. Population around 40,000. The pack that holds the territory has been the Draven line for 200 years. The current Alpha King took power at 22 following the death of his father under unclear circumstances. She paused. Economy is struggling. The ban on enchantment work has closed off half the trade routes that used to flow through the northern pass. 3 frontier packs have quietly pulled their loyalty pledges in the last 2 years. A longer pause this time. You did your research, he said. I had time, she said. The unclear circumstances around my father's death, he said, without any particular emphasis. You have a theory about those. I have an accurate understanding of them, she said. The same curse that will one day concern your advisors about you concerned them about him. The carriage was quiet for a moment. You know about the curse, he said. It was not a question. The Draven curse is not a secret in any library the Veldmoor auction house had access to, she said. And I read everything the Veldmoor auction house had access to. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the direct assessing way that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things. And knowing that, you still agreed. You still chose me, she said, knowing what the rumors said about what I might be. The carriage continued north. The mountains grew. Truce, he said finally. We're already married, she said. I think it's a little late for truces. This time, the almost smile completed itself, just barely, just for a moment. It was the first real thing she'd seen on his face, and she filed it away the way she filed everything away, carefully, precisely, in the part of herself that was still taking inventory of every possible resource she had. She was going to need all of them. Thus, Ironspire at night looked like something from a story that hadn't decided yet whether it was beautiful or terrifying. The palace rose from the mountain's base in tiers of dark stone and iron-framed windows, lit from within so that it glowed amber and gold against the blue-black of the winter sky. The city below it was quieter at this hour, though not empty. Leora could see the lights of taverns and workshops and the moving lanterns of night watch guards along the main thoroughfare. The carriage pulled through the palace gates, and Leora watched the guards snap to attention, watched the gatemaster signal the interior staff, watched the whole machinery of royal arrival set itself in motion with practiced efficiency. When the carriage door opened, she was looking at a woman she didn't know. Tall, severe-faced, with the bearing of someone who had managed powerful households for a very long time and was currently running several calculations about this new development. Your Grace, the woman said, directing this at KL. Then, with slightly less certainty, to Leora, Your Majesty. Your Majesty. Leora stepped down from the carriage. She kept the hood up. She felt the assembled household staff looking at her. The collective weight of their attention, their curiosity, their unasked questions. And she stood in the center of it with the same stillness she'd spent years developing. Kael came to stand beside her. He looked at the assembled staff with an expression that communicated exactly 3 things: that his queen was to be afforded every courtesy, that questions were not welcome, and that anyone who had a problem with either of those facts was welcome to discuss it with him personally. No one had a problem with either of those facts. Your rooms are prepared, Wasfirius, the severe-faced woman, whose name Leora would shortly learn, was Myron, and who would become the closest thing to an ally she had in this palace, said, If your Majesty wishes to rest. I'd like to see the library first, Leora said. A beat of silence. The library, Marin repeated. Unless there's a reason I can't. Marin looked at Kael. Kael said nothing, which was apparently answer enough. I'll have someone take you, she said. Leora looked at the mountain rising above the palace, at the pale stars cut off by the mass of it, at the iron gates closing behind the carriage. She thought about the coal still held in her fist, the private refusal she had carried out of Veldmoor, and she let herself, just for a moment, just briefly, feel something that was not quite relief and not quite hope, but occupied the same approximate territory. She was not going to disappear. She had a library to explore. She followed the staff member down the corridor, her cloak trailing behind her on the stone floor, her unmarked hand and her gloved one moving at her sides, and she walked into Ironspire the way she intended to walk through everything else the northern frontier had left to throw at her. Upright, eyes forward, already planning. The library of Ironspire was not what Leora had expected. She had expected something functional, shelves, catalogs, the bureaucratic arrangement of a working monarch's reference collection. What she found instead was a room that had clearly been loved once, by someone who was no longer around to love it. The shelves ran floor to ceiling, 3 stories tall, connected by iron spiral staircases that had gone slightly green with age. The books were organized in a system she didn't immediately recognize, not alphabetical, not by subject in any conventional sense, but in some private logic that seemed to track ideas rather than categories. Philosophy bleeding into military history, bleeding into agricultural theory, bleeding into maps. Someone had thought carefully about how knowledge connected to other knowledge. She spent 3 hours in there before the fatigue of the day finally caught up with her, and Marin appeared in the doorway with the patient expression of someone who had waited long enough. "Your rooms, Your Majesty," Marin said. "Before you fall asleep standing up." Leora closed the book she'd been holding, a treatise on Northern Pack law, annotated in the margins in small, precise handwriting she didn't recognize yet, and followed her out. Her rooms were in the east wing, connected to the king's chambers by a long corridor that had its own guard post at each end. The rooms themselves were larger than any space she had ever personally occupied. A sitting room, a dressing room, a bedroom with a fireplace already burning, and a bed that was almost offensively large. Everything was done in shades of dark blue and iron gray, which she suspected was less about welcoming a new queen and more about the fact that no one had been asked to decorate specifically for her. She didn't mind. "The staff knows not to ask about your hood," Marin said, setting a lamp on the bedside table. The king's instructions were clear on that point. "And their opinions?" Marin was quiet for a beat that said more than words would have. "They'll adapt," she said finally. "This household has adapted to more difficult things." After she left, Leora sat on the edge of the enormous bed and looked at the fire and allowed herself, in the privacy of an empty room, to feel the full weight of what the last 12 hours had been. The auction hall, the contract room, the carriage ride north, the palace gates closing behind her. She was queen of the Northern Territories. She was 24 years old. She had not eaten since morning. She ate the food that had been left on the sitting room table, cold now, but adequate, and went to bed still wearing the glove on her marked hand, the way she had slept every night for 6 years. The palace settled into its rhythms around her over the following days, and Leora settled into her observation of those rhythms with the systematic patience of someone who understood that information was survival. She learned the staff quickly. Marin ran the household with the efficiency of a general managing a campaign, and her loyalty was to the smooth functioning of Ironspire rather than to any particular member of it, which meant that Leora, as a functioning part of the institution, earned her respect incrementally and without drama, simply by not creating problems. The kitchen staff were curious but professional. The guards were correct to the point of blankness. The ladies-in-waiting assigned to her, 3 of them, the daughters of minor territorial lords whose families had sent them to court for the political positioning such placements implied, were a more complicated matter. Their names were Senna, Brix, and Aurea. They were all between 20 and 26, all reasonably well trained in the performance of deference, and all deeply, visibly uncomfortable with the queen they had been assigned to serve. Leora understood this without requiring them to articulate it. She was the wrong kind of queen in too many ways to count. Unknown family, restricted file, perpetually hooded, chosen by the king over every better option available. They didn't know what she was. They didn't know what was under the hood. They had theories, and the theories were not flattering. She didn't try to correct the theories. She let them run. What she did instead was work. The palace had a war room she had not been invited to and an economic council she had not been informed of, and the first week she was at Ironspire, both of these became apparent through the sounds that filtered through walls and the papers that passed across the desks of assistants who weren't careful about where they left things. She read what she could reach. She asked Marin careful, indirect questions. She spent every free hour in the library, working through the annotated books she'd noticed on her first night, building a picture of the kingdom she was now nominally ruling a half of. The picture was not pretty. The Northern Territories were struggling in ways that the court's formal language obscured but couldn't entirely hide. The ban on enchantment work, a law passed 40 years ago in the aftermath of the Fire Witch purges, which had then been broadened to cover all magical practice, had progressively strangled the frontier economy. The northern pass trade routes had once run on an enchantment-facilitated system of preserved goods, weather-warded passage, and magically reinforced infrastructure that let merchants move through the mountain corridors in winter. Without it, the winter routes had become impassable, cutting the north off from the southern trade markets for 4 months of every year. 3 generations of slow economic erosion had followed. The frontier packs that had quietly pulled their loyalty pledges in the last 2 years had not done so because they preferred a different king. They had done so because they needed a different answer to a problem that the current laws couldn't solve, and they had run out of patience waiting for one. Leora thought about this constantly. She thought about it the way she'd always thought about problems. Not with frustration, but with a kind of focused hunger, the same hunger that had driven her through every book in whatever room she'd been locked in, searching for the piece of understanding that would make the shape of a thing finally clear. She was still thinking about it on the 8th day, when Kael sent for her for the first time. The message came through Marin, who delivered it with studied neutrality. The king requested her presence in his study after the evening meal. The phrasing was courteous and the timing was deliberate. Evening, private, after the formality of the day had concluded. His study was on the 3rd floor of the palace's central tower, accessible via a staircase that bypassed the main public corridors. It was a room that suited him, large enough to be functional, undecorated beyond what was necessary, dominated by a desk the size of a dining table that was currently covered in maps and documents weighted at their corners with whatever heavy object had been within reach when they were spread out. An iron candle holder with 6 arms, a compass, a ceremonial dagger that had probably not started the evening as a paperweight. He was standing at the desk when she arrived, not sitting, reading something he put down when she entered. He looked at her for a moment, at the hood, at the set of her shoulders, at her hands, and then gestured at the chair on the opposite side of the desk. "Sit down," he said. It was not unfriendly, it was just direct. She sat. He sat across from her. The desk was between them, which she suspected was not accidental. He picked up a document and held it out. She took it. It was a council summary. The most recent economic report from the frontier territories, written in the careful, passive language of officials who want to convey bad news without appearing to convey bad news. "Read it," he said. She already had, in a slightly earlier draft she'd found in a corridor 2 days ago, but she read it again and let him watch her read it. When she finished, she set it back on the desk. "The Greywood Settlement Pact sent a formal notice of reduced tribute this morning," he said. "The 3rd in 6 months. They're not refusing outright. Not yet. They're reducing." "Which is what you do," Leora said, "when you're building toward a refusal but want to give the other party time to offer you a reason not to." He looked at her steadily. "What would you tell them?" It was a test. She recognized it as one and didn't resent it. It was the correct way to assess someone whose competence you had no prior evidence of. She considered her answer for a moment, not because she didn't have one, but because she wanted to give the right one, the full one, not the answer that was easiest to say. "The tribute reduction isn't about the money," she said. "You know that. They're not struggling financially. The Greywood timber market has actually held up reasonably well even without the pass routes. This is a political signal. They want to know if the king is going to remain inflexible on the enchantment ban. The ban is law. The ban is 40-year-old law written in response to a specific crisis that the current generation didn't experience and doesn't feel bound by." She kept her voice neutral, factual. "The frontier packs are pragmatic. They'll accept a lot of things from their king if those things don't actively cost them survival. But the enchantment ban is costing them survival. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. 4 months of closed pass routes every year, compounded over 40 years, adds up to an enormous amount of lost economic capacity. The ban exists for reasons beyond economics. The Fire Witch purges," she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. "You know about those too." "I know about most things I have access to books about," she said. "The purges were a response to a genuine threat. I'm not dismissing that, but the legislation that followed them banned all magical practice, not just fire witchcraft. The frontier's weather workers, its preservation specialists, its structural enchanters, they were all caught in the same net. And the net hasn't loosened in 40 years. He was quiet for a moment, He was looking at her with that direct, assessing attention she was becoming familiar with, and she returned it steadily. "What would you do?" he asked. "I would begin with a territorial exception," she said. "Not a repeal. That's politically impossible right now, and trying for it would cost you more capital than it gained you. But a limited, monitored exception for specific classes of non-fire enchantment in designated frontier territories. It gives the Greywood Pack what they actually need. It gives you a policy shift without the appearance of full reversal, and it buys you time to build toward the larger conversation." Silence. "You've been here 8 days," he said. "I read quickly," she said. Something that was becoming the familiar almost smile appeared, and this time stayed on his face for a full 3 seconds before he gathered it back in. He looked down at the maps on his desk, then back at her. "The council won't like it." "The council doesn't like anything that represents change," she said. "That's not a reason." He picked up the document and turned it over in his hands. "I'll consider it," he said. It was not agreement, but coming from Kyle Draven, who had spent 9 years making 40-something territorial lords feel the weight of an unyielding no, she understood it for what it was. A door opened a crack. She stood. Was there anything else? He glanced up. "Stay," he said. She paused. "Not for any formal purpose," he said, and there was something different in his voice. Not softer exactly, but less armored. "I haven't had an undefended conversation in this room in a long time." She looked at him for a moment, then she sat back down. They talked for 2 more hours in the lamplight, with the maps spread between them and the fire burning low in the grate. They talked about the frontier territories, about pack law and its history, about the mountains and the pass routes, and the particular stubbornness of a population that had survived generations of brutal winters by refusing to accept that survival was ever someone else's responsibility. He knew his kingdom with the kind of deep, unsentimental love that didn't require poetry. He knew its fault lines and its strengths and the specific personalities of its most difficult actors with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention for 9 years. She had read about it. He had lived it. Between the two of them, the picture of the northern territories that formed across that desk was sharper than either could have made alone. She noticed somewhere around the 2nd hour that he was no longer looking at the maps when he spoke. He was looking at the shadow of her hood, not with the invasive curiosity of someone trying to see through it, but with the attention of someone listening to a voice and trying to locate, by its sound alone, the person it belonged to. She found this, to her surprise, easier to bear than the looking away. When she finally stood to leave, the palace had gone quiet around them, the deep quiet of very late night. "Tomorrow evening," he said. Not a question. "Tomorrow evening," she agreed. Walking back through the corridor to her own rooms, Leora acknowledged to herself, with the same clear-eyed honesty she applied to everything else, that she had not expected this. She had expected cold utility, the arranged transaction they had both signed their names to. She had not expected someone who read his kingdom the way she read books, who asked her opinion and then actually listened to the answer, who requested her presence in the most low-maintenance way possible, and then kept her there for 2 hours on the basis of nothing more than a conversation worth having. She kept her guard up. She had not survived 6 years of careful invisibility by abandoning useful habits. But she was honest enough with herself to note that the guard had a new pressure on it, and that the pressure was coming from the inside. The court's reaction to their new queen solidified over the following weeks into something Leora could map as precisely as the frontier territories on Kael's desk. The household staff had adapted, as Marin predicted. The guards had settled into professional indifference. The kitchen sent her food she'd mentioned once in passing that she preferred, which she took as the staff's particular form of acceptance. The ladies-in-waiting were a different story. Senna, Aurea, and Brix had not adapted. They had instead organized in the subtle, multi-layered way that women trained in court dynamics organized when they wanted to apply pressure without appearing to. They were always present, always correct in their formal duties, and always performing their unease in ways calibrated to be deniable. The slight hesitation before obeying a request, the glances exchanged when Leora spoke, the conversations that stopped a fraction of a second too late when she entered a room. The rumor they were circulating, Leora tracked it through Marin's careful, oblique briefings, had evolved from the auction house whispers into something more specific and more dangerous. The restricted file had become a confirmed deformity in the telling. The deformity had become a curse mark. The curse mark had become, in the most elaborate versions of the story, evidence that the new queen was responsible for some past catastrophe that had left her marked and unmateable, and that Kael had been manipulated or deceived into choosing her. None of this was said where Liora could hear it. All of it was said where she would eventually learn it had been said. She let it run. She was watching where it went. Where it went, eventually, was the council. The King's Council of the Northern Territories consisted of 7 members: the chief advisor, the military commander, the trade commissioner, the territorial liaison, the historical records keeper, and 2 senior pack lords who served rotating terms. They met weekly in the council chamber, and for the first month of Leora's presence at Ironspire, she had been entirely absent from those meetings, not by her choice, but by the unspoken understanding that the Queen's presence had not been requested. On the 5th week, she requested it herself. She put the request through Marin, who put it to Kyle's assistant, who put it to Kyle. The answer came back within 2 hours. The chair at the council table's far end would be available. The morning of the council meeting, Senna appeared in her sitting room while she was reviewing documents and sat down without being invited, which was itself a statement. "Your Majesty should be careful about the council meeting today," Senna said. Her tone was helpful in the way that a blade is helpful when it belongs to the person holding it. "Should I?" Leora said, without looking up. "The council members have concerns about the Queen's situation." A pause waited with significance. "Lord Varek, in particular, has made comments about the importance of transparency in the royal household, given the restrictions on your file." Leora turned a page. "Lord Varek is welcome to his concerns. He's the senior pack lord, Your Majesty. His family has held that seat for 4 generations. His opinions carry considerable weight." "I know who Lord Varek is," Leora said. She finally looked up, and she gave Senna the full weight of her attention. Not hostile, but complete. The kind of attention that made people suddenly aware of being observed more clearly than they'd intended. "Is this a warning, Senna, or a message?" Senna held her ground, but something in her posture shifted incrementally. "A warning, Your Majesty." "Then I appreciate it," Leora said. "You're dismissed." Senna left. Leora returned to her documents, read for another 20 minutes, and then dressed for the council meeting with the same focus she brought to everything. Not performatively, not with armor as costume, but simply with care. She wore the hood, as always. She wore her best gloves. She walked into the council chamber at precisely the scheduled time, took the chair that had been provided at the table's far end, and folded her hands in her lap. The council members looked at her with varying qualities of discomfort. Lord Varek, seated to Kyle's left, looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's already decided the solution to. He was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with the deliberate physicality of an alpha who had never entirely accepted that politics had superseded fighting as the primary arena of power. His face was weathered and authoritative, and he wore his pack insignia with the pointed prominence of someone who wanted it noticed. Kale opened the meeting without acknowledging the tension in the room, which was his own particular form of management, not ignoring things, but refusing to grant them the status of crises before they'd earned it. The agenda moved through its standard items: border reports, tribute summaries, supply requests from the outer settlements. Then the trade commissioner, a careful man named Aldrich, who Leora had assessed as pragmatic rather than political, raised the issue of the Greywood tribute reduction. "The settlement has indicated they'll be sending a delegation next month," Aldrich said. "I recommend we prepare a formal response position before they arrive." "The response position is unchanged," said Lord Varek, before anyone else could speak. "The tribute terms are in the treaty, and the king's obligations under that treaty don't bend to pack pressure." "With respect," Aldrich said carefully, "the settlement isn't applying pressure in the conventional sense. They're applying it economically, which is a different and more sustained type." "The difference being irrelevant," Varek's voice was flat. "Rewarding economic pressure with concessions teaches every other frontier pack that pressure is the correct approach." Leora had been quiet. She remained quiet for another 3 seconds, which was long enough for Varek's position to establish itself in the room's air, and not long enough for it to calcify into consensus. The concern about precedent is legitimate, she said. It's also incomplete. Every head at the table turned toward her. Kael, at the far end, watched without intervening. The settlement isn't applying pressure because they believe pressure works on this king, she continued. They're applying pressure because they've run out of other ways to communicate urgency. If the council interprets every frontier economic signal as a dominance test, the analysis will always recommend holding the line, and holding the line has been the council's position for 40 years, which is part of why three-pack loyalty pledges have quietly been withdrawn in the past 2 years. Silence. Varric's expression had moved through surprise into something harder. The queen speaks as if she has a familiarity with these territories. I read, she said, which is available to anyone. Reading and governing are different competencies. Agreed, she said pleasantly, which is why I'm suggesting a policy analysis rather than a policy decision. If the data supports holding the current position, then hold it. But the analysis should be current, not inherited. Varric looked at Kael. It was the look of a man who expected his king to manage his new wife back into her proper lane. Your Grace, he said, with a pointed edge. Kael looked at Varric for a moment. Then he looked at Aldrich. Prepare the analysis, he said. I want it before the delegation arrives. Varric's jaw tightened visibly. He said nothing. Leora said nothing either. She had said what she came to say, and she had no interest in pressing the advantage beyond what was useful. She sat quietly through the rest of the meeting, watching, filing, building her map of who in that room could be worked with and who was going to require a different approach entirely. After the meeting, in the corridor, Corvin fell into step beside her. He was a man she had developed a cautious respect for. He was anxious and political, but he was also perceptive, and perception in a court environment was a form of honesty she could work with. Lord Varric, he said quietly, without preamble, has been the most influential voice on this council for 11 years. He and the late king were close. I know, she said. He considers the queen's role in this court to be... Corvin searched for the right word with visible effort. Ceremonial. Most people consider it ceremonial, she said. That's a temporary misapprehension. Corvin looked at her with an expression that was almost, she thought, admiring. It was gone quickly, replaced by his more standard anxious professionalism. Yes, well, he said, I simply wanted you to know that Lord Varric has friends in the outer territories, and his friends talk to other friends. I appreciate the warning, she said. She did appreciate it. She also did not break her stride. The evenings continued. This was how she began to think of them, simply as the evenings, a shorthand that required no further specification because there was nothing else at Ironspire that occupied the same category of her attention. Every night, after the day's formal obligations were concluded, she went to Kael's study and they talked. Sometimes they worked, going through territorial reports, drafting response letters, arguing over the precise language of policy that had to be firm enough to hold, but flexible enough not to break the thing it was meant to protect. Sometimes they simply talked, the way people talk who have discovered each other unexpectedly and are still in the process of mapping the discovery. He told her, piece by piece, about the 9 years before she arrived, not as complaint or confession, but as simple history, the kind shared between people who are doing the work of trusting each other without entirely admitting that's what they're doing. He told her about his father, briefly, with the economy of language people use when a subject is real enough to hurt. He told her about the first years of his reign, the specific loneliness of authority that can't be shared, the way a crown isolates by design because the design was made by people who believed isolation was the same as strength. She told him less, but something. She was careful with what she offered, not from dishonesty, but from the deeply ingrained habit of self-protection that 6 years of isolation had built into her at the structural level. She told him about the books. She told him about the logic of ideas connecting to other ideas, the way the library's organizational system had made a kind of sense to her immediately, and what she thought it said about whoever had built it. My mother, he said. She organized that library. She held on to that, filed it away, carefully. The darkness between them, literal darkness, the rooms always lit by fire and lamp rather than full light, which was a condition neither of them had arranged but neither had changed, became something she'd stopped registering as absence and started registering as presence. She could not see his face clearly in this light, and he could not see hers at all. What they had was voice and thought and the quality of attention they chose to give each other, which was, she was discovering, a kind of seeing that didn't require eyes. She was careful. She was always careful. But she was also honest with herself about what was growing in that room, the way an accurate assessment of terrain requires acknowledging the obstacles and the openings both. She had been at Ironspire for 6 weeks when things outside the study became considerably more dangerous. The Greywood delegation arrived 2 weeks early. Not to negotiate, to deliver a message. 3 pack lords in the delegation, which was one more than the usual diplomatic configuration, which meant it wasn't entirely a diplomatic visit. They came with an escort of 8 soldiers, which was 4 more than courtesy required. And the message they delivered to the council in formal session, read aloud by their senior representative in the flat, precise voice of someone who had rehearsed for impact, was this. The Greywood Settlement, the Ashvale Ridge Pack, and the Thornfield Collective were formally proposing a unified trade compact that would operate outside the Northern Territorial Treaty structure. They were not declaring independence. They were not withdrawing their loyalty pledges. They were proposing, and the word proposing was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, an alternative economic arrangement that would allow them to restore their winter trade routes through methods currently prohibited under territorial law, meaning they wanted to use enchantment work, and they were doing it through an alliance structure that implied what they would do if the answer was no. The council erupted. Varick's voice was loudest, as expected. This is exactly what accommodation produces, he said, and he didn't look at Leora directly, but the angle of his address made the implication clear. The moment this court signals flexibility, the frontier interprets it as an invitation. The analysis Aldrich prepared, Leora said, from her chair at the table's end, indicates that the 3 territories in this compact represent, collectively, 41% of the northern frontier's total pack population. Refusing a proposed trade compact without offering an alternative doesn't hold a line, it cedes it. The Queen, Varick said, with a deliberateness that put the words in a frame she was clearly meant to notice, has been in these territories for 6 weeks. The Council has been managing frontier relations for decades. Perhaps some deference to that experience is appropriate. The room was very quiet. Leora looked at Varick steadily. She thought about 6 years of a room getting smaller. She thought about a coal held in a fist. She thought about the private refusal that had carried her out of Veldmoor and north through the mountains to this chair at this table, and she kept her voice level and completely clear. The experience of doing something the same way for decades, she said, is not the same as evidence that it's the right way. 41% of the frontier's pack population is not a diplomatic problem. It's an arithmetic one. And the arithmetic says the current approach has a ceiling. Varick stood up. It was a physical claim on the room, deliberate, alpha-coded, the posture of a man who was used to his standing up meaning something. This council, he said, does not take its policy from a woman whose face no one in this kingdom has seen and whose origins are a file marked restricted in a Veldmoor auction house. The silence that followed had a different quality than all the previous silences in that room. It was the silence of a line being crossed and everyone knowing it. Leora looked at him. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. "Sit down, Lord Varick," said Kael. He said it once, quietly, without emphasis. Varick sat. Kael looked at Aldrich. "Draft a counter-proposal for the compact. Limited enchantment licensing for non-fire categories, subject to council oversight and royal charter review. Have it ready in 48 hours. Aldrich nodded. Kael looked at the Greywood delegation representatives. "Tell your lords they'll have a formal response within the week." The representatives nodded and withdrew. The council meeting ended with the stiff, overcorrect politeness of people who have witnessed something they will be analyzing in private for a long time. Varick left without looking at Leora. She watched him go and thought, not finished. He's not finished. This was the opening move of something, not the whole of it. She was right. 3 days later, Marin came to her in the library with a face that had rearranged itself into careful neutrality in the way it only did when the news was genuinely difficult. "There's a formal objection circulating among 3 of the council members," Marin said. requesting a review of the Queen's contract on the grounds of incomplete disclosure at the time of signing. Leora set down the book she was holding. They're arguing, Marin continued, that the restricted file constitutes a material concealment, and that if the nature of the restriction were fully disclosed, the contract might not have been legal. They're trying to void the marriage, Leora said. They're trying to create the conditions for voiding it, Marin said, which is different and more dangerous, because it doesn't require them to succeed. It requires them only to generate enough doubt. Leora was quiet for a moment. Who signed the objection? She asked. Marin named 3 names. Varric was one of them. And the king? Has been informed. Marin's expression held something carefully between professional and personal. He has not yet formally responded. Leora nodded. She picked the book back up and looked at the page without reading it. The coal in her fist was burning hotter now. The fist was tighter. And the thing pressing against her from the inside, the thing she had been careful to keep contained, to keep functional, to keep from becoming anything that could be used against her, was no longer entirely willing to stay quiet. She thought about the evenings. She thought about his voice in the low light, telling her about his first years as king. She thought about the way he had looked at her hood, not trying to see through it, but trying to locate the person behind it. She thought, he hasn't responded yet. She didn't know what that meant. She couldn't know yet. What she knew was that the walls of Ironspire were smaller than they had been a month ago, and getting smaller, and that she had survived smaller walls than this, and come out the other side with something to show for it. She turned the page. She kept reading. She kept reading for another hour. Then she closed the book, set it precisely on the shelf where she'd found it, and went to find Kael. She didn't send a message through Marin. She didn't request an appointment through Corvan. She walked to the central tower, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the door of his study with the specific knock she'd developed over 2 months of evening visits. 3 counts, brief, unhurried, the knock that meant it's me, and I'm not asking permission. Come in, he said. He was at his desk, which was its natural state. The lamp was lit. The maps were spread. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted in the way it only shifted when it was her. A fractional loosening, the particular quality of attention he gave her that was different from the attention he gave everything else. She had stopped pretending not to notice this. She sat down across from him without being invited, which was also its natural state by now. Marin told you, he said. It was not a question. She did. I was going to tell you myself tonight. I know. She held his gaze. What is your formal response going to be? He set down the pen he'd been holding. I haven't decided. Something shifted in her chest. Not the coal, not the refusal. Something more immediate and less manageable. She held it very still. Kael. It was the first time she had used his name without his title. They both noticed it at the same time, in the small silence that followed. The objection has no legal standing, he said. The contract was properly executed. The restricted file is a documentation category, not a concealment mechanism. The auction house's own terms allow for it. Varric knows that, she said. The legal argument isn't his real argument. No, he agreed. It isn't. His real argument is that I'm a liability he doesn't have enough information about, and that the uncertainty of what's under this hood is more dangerous to his political position than the known costs of removing me. Kael was quiet for a moment. He's not entirely wrong about the uncertainty. No, she said. He isn't. Another silence, a different kind. The kind that has something in the middle of it, something neither person has named yet, because naming it changes the weight of the room. I need to know, he said finally. Not what's under the hood. I told you that condition doesn't change. He paused. I need to know if what the rumors say about you is something that puts this kingdom in danger. She looked at him for a long time. I won't put this kingdom in danger, she said. It was the most honest answer she could give, and it was not quite the same as answering his question, and they both knew it. He held her gaze. That's not the same thing as a no. No, she said quietly. It isn't. The fire in the grate crackled and resettled. Outside the tower window, the mountain was invisible in the dark, but she could feel it the way you feel very large things that are very close, as a pressure, as a mass, as a fact of the landscape that everything else had to account for. "I'll reject the objection," he said. Something in her loosened that she hadn't known was held. "On the grounds of procedural invalidity," he continued, "which is true and sufficient and doesn't require any further disclosure from you." He picked the pen back up. "But Leora." He said her name with the same deliberateness she'd used with his, aware of it, choosing it. "Whatever it is, I need you to tell me before someone else does." She nodded, once. "When I'm ready," she said. He accepted this. That was the particular quality of him that she had come to understand as his form of trust, not demanding the answer before she was capable of giving it, but making absolutely clear that the door was open and that when she walked through it, he would be on the other side. She walked back to her rooms through the quiet corridors of Ironspire and stood at the window of her sitting room for a long time, looking at the lights of the city below. The coal in her fist was changing in character. It was less like something held in defiance and more like something waiting for the right moment to be set down. She was not ready yet, but she could see ready from here, and that was new. Varrick's formal objection was rejected within 24 hours, issued in a one-sentence administrative notice that was technically courteous and substantively dismissive. The 3 council members who had signed it received their copies without comment from the king. It should have ended there. Instead, it went underground. Leora tracked it through the palace's social ecosystem with the same methodical attention she brought to the library, listening to what Marin reported, observing the quality of silences in rooms when she entered them, noting which of the outer hall conversations stopped too quickly, and which of the staff's expressions had developed the particular careful blankness of people who were carrying information they'd been told not to share. What was circulating now was not a legal argument. It was a story. The story had multiple versions, as all effective court rumors do. In the most restrained version, the queen was hiding a significant deformity that made her unfit to bear heirs. In the middle version, she was hiding a curse mark that could spread to anyone who encountered her uncovered. In the most dramatic version, the one that had apparently originated somewhere in the connection between Varrick's household and 2 of the outer court social circles, she was hiding the brand of a fire witch, the same mark that had been burned into the hands of the creatures responsible for the Veldmoor massacres 40 years ago. And the restricted file existed not to protect her privacy, but to prevent the information from triggering the territorial law that required fire witches to be reported to the crown. The law that required fire witches to be reported to the crown. Leora read this in Marin's briefing notes. Marin had stopped trying to soften her reports after week 3, having correctly assessed that Leora preferred precision over comfort, and she sat with it for a moment. The law was real. She had read it in the palace archives 2 weeks ago, in a collection of territorial statutes she'd been working through in order. Any person bearing the mark of fire witchcraft, identified through visible brand or observable magical manifestation, must be reported to the Crown's Office of Territorial Order within 72 hours of identification. Failure to report constitutes concealment, punishable by... She had closed that volume and moved to the next one. The law was 40 years old. It was also, as far as she could determine from the legal scholarship she'd subsequently located, never been formally challenged, never been modified, and never been struck down. If the story reached the right ears with enough velocity, if it moved from court rumor to formal accusation before Kael had the political footing to manage it, the situation would stop being about palace social dynamics and become a legal matter. And in a legal matter, the restricted file could be compelled open. She had perhaps 2 weeks before that happened, if the current momentum held. She spent those 2 weeks doing what she always did when she needed to understand something completely before she could act on it. She went to the library. What she was looking for was not general history. She was looking for specifics, the actual origins of the Veldmoor massacres, the events that had triggered the Fire Witch purges, the names and facts and sequence of things that had been compressed over 40 years into a story simple enough to sustain a law and a fear and a cultural scar that had never properly healed. The library's historical records section was extensive. It was also, she discovered quickly, incomplete in very specific ways. The general histories of the period were present. The official territorial records were present. The personal accounts, the correspondence, the documentation from the period's legal proceedings, these were systematically absent, not disorganized, not lost, not misfiled. Absent. There were shelf slots where volumes should have been, and the cataloging system that Kael's mother had built so carefully showed exactly where they should sit, and the slots were empty. Someone had removed them. She didn't panic. Panic was for situations where you had no alternative path. She thought about what the absence meant, who would have had access when it would have been done, what their motivation would have been, and she began working backward through the records that remained, looking for the shadow cast by the missing documents rather than the documents themselves. It took her 9 days. What she found, assembled from fragments, from marginal references and surviving texts, from a single surviving letter in a collection of administrative correspondence that had apparently been overlooked because it was misfiled under agricultural procurement, was this. The Veldmoor massacres had not been caused by fire witches acting independently. They had been caused by fire witches responding to an attack. 40 years ago, a collective of fire witches in the Veldmoor territories had been operating legally, uncomfortably, under restriction, but legally. They provided weather control, structural reinforcement, the specific categories of fire-based magic that the northern frontier needed and that no other magical discipline could replicate. The attack on their settlement had been organized, premeditated, and the surviving records, the ones someone had tried very hard to ensure would not survive, pointed toward a consortium of territorial lords who had wanted the witches' land, their resources, and above all their political influence, removed from the frontier's power structure. The fire that had burned Veldmoor's eastern quarter, the fire that had become the justification for the purges, had started in the witches' settlement. But it had not started there because the witches set it. It had started there because someone had set it on them. She sat with this for a long time in the quiet of the library. Then she thought about the brand on the back of her hand. She thought about her father telling her, at the age of 14, that the mark was a curse, a punishment, something to be ashamed of and hidden and never spoken of. She thought about the room that had gotten smaller. She thought about the word restricted in small, nervous handwriting on her auction file. And she thought about her father's own financial history. The collapsed pack, the bad alliances, the territory sales that had happened when she was a child and that she had never been given the full accounting of. The missing library volumes had been removed before she arrived, before Kael's reign, almost certainly. The organization system was his mother's, and the gaps in it were older than his tenure. Someone in the previous administration, or the one before that, had understood what those records contained and had made a decision about their continued existence. She needed to know who. And she understood now with complete clarity, to tell Kael, not because she was ready, not because the timing was right, but because whatever was coming, and something was coming, she could feel it the way the mountain felt like a pressure in the dark. She could not face it without the one alliance that actually mattered in this palace. She closed the last folder. She got up. She went to find him. He wasn't in his study. He was in the war room, which she hadn't been in before, standing over a table of maps with his military commander and 2 of the territorial liaisons. She stood in the doorway and met Corvan's eyes across the room, and something in her expression communicated enough that he crossed to her without being asked. "I need to speak to the king tonight," she said quietly. "Privately. It's not a social request." Corvan looked at her face, as much of it as the hood allowed him to see, which was still more than most people had managed to read correctly. "How urgent?" he said. "Urgent enough that I came here instead of waiting." He nodded and went back into the room. She watched him lean in and say something low to Kael, watched Kael look up, look toward the doorway, hold her gaze for a moment across the room full of maps and military planning. Something passed between them that didn't need words. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. He came to her sitting room instead of his study, which was itself something, a choice, a territory offered rather than held. He sat in the chair across from hers and waited, and the waiting was absolute, the particular quality of his attention that gave you all of it and demanded nothing in return until you were ready to give something back. She had been organizing what she needed to say for the last hour. She had it structured, efficient, the important facts in sequence. She opened her mouth to deliver the structured version. What came out instead was, "I need to tell you who I am." He didn't move. He waited. "My name is Leora Vale," she said. "You know that. What you don't know is what the name means. It's what my family's history actually is, as opposed to what my father told people it was." She paused. "The brand on my hand. The one in the rumors. It's real." The room was very quiet. "It's a fire witch mark," she said. "Congenital. I was born with it. It appeared when I was 6 years old, and my father recognized it for what it was, and spent the next 14 years doing everything he could to bury it." She kept her voice even. "He told me it was a curse. He told me it made me dangerous and unclean and unmarketable. He locked me in a progressively smaller series of rooms, and he sold me at auction with a restricted file because he'd run out of money, and I was the last asset he had." She watched Kael's face. It had not changed expression, but she knew him well enough now to read what was underneath the expression. And what was underneath it was controlled and careful and entirely focused. "I believed what he told me for a long time," she continued. "I stopped believing it about 3 years ago, when I had access to enough books to start constructing an alternative account. I've been looking for the complete alternative account since I got to your library." She reached into her pocket and put the misfiled letter on the table between them. "I found the beginning of it." He picked up the letter. "Read it." "Set it down." "The Veldmoor massacres," he said, "were not what the official history says they were," she said. "The records that would prove it have been removed from your library. I don't know by whom or when, but it happened before your reign. Your mother's cataloging system shows exactly where they belong." She held his gaze. "Your territories have been running a 40-year economy of fear based on a version of events that may have been engineered by the same people who benefited most from the purges." He was very still. "What does this have to do with your father specifically?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said, "but he sold off 3 of his pack's territorial holdings when I was between the ages of 8 and 12, the years when the mark was becoming identifiable. The sales were cheap, under market. The buyers were all from the same consortium of northern families." She paused. "I think he was paying for silence, and I think the silence was about more than just me." Kael stood up. He moved to the window, not looking out, looking inward, processing, with that quality of stillness that was really motion happening at a level below the visible. "The objection Varric filed," he said. "The restricted file. The story circulating in the court." He turned. "If someone has been managing what the court knows about fire witches for 40 years, they have a reason to manage it now too." "Yes," she said. "Which means the story, reaching the right ears, isn't accidental." "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked at her. His expression was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. It was open in a way that cost him something, and he was doing it anyway. "How long have you known?" he said. "About the mark? Since I was 6. A pause. "About what it actually means, what I might actually be capable of. I'm still learning." "The fire," he said. "Have you ever—" "No." She met his eyes. "It was sealed. My father had someone seal it when I was 10. I haven't been able to access it since." She looked down at her gloved hand. "I can feel it. I have always been able to feel it, but it's been behind a wall for 14 years. He crossed the room and sat down again, closer than before, close enough that she could see the specific quality of winter light in his eyes without needing the lamp. "I'm not going to let them void the contract," he said. "I'm not going to let them remove you from this palace. And I am going to find out who took those records from my library." "Kael, these are not negotiable positions," he said. "They're statements of what's going to happen." She looked at him for a long moment. The coal in her fist had changed so much from what it had been in Veldmoor's auction gallery. It was still heat, still the hard, burning thing that had kept her upright through 6 years of smaller rooms and smaller futures. But it was something else now, too. Something that had a direction instead of just a will. "There's one more thing," she said. He waited. "If someone is managing this story, if there's a coordinated effort to expose me before I can control the terms of the exposure, the timing they'll choose is the worst possible moment. the moment where it does the most damage and leaves me the fewest options. When would that be? He said. She had been thinking about this for 2 days. The Territorial Summit, she said, next month. Every major pack lord in the Northern Territories in the same room, including the Greywood delegation you're currently negotiating the trade compact with. If the accusation is made in that room, in front of that audience, the legal mechanism triggers automatically. The reporting law requires an investigation, and an investigation in that context, in front of witnesses from every territory, becomes a political crisis regardless of the outcome. He was quiet. Then we have a month, he said. We have a month, she agreed. Chat. The next 3 weeks moved with the compressed, anxious velocity of time that knows it's running out. Kale set Corvan to discreet research on the library's missing volumes, tasking him with tracing the removal through the palace's historical records management logs without announcing why. He assigned 2 additional guards to Leora's wing without explanation. He accelerated the trade compact negotiations with the Greywood delegation, pushing toward a signed agreement before the summit, understanding, as she did, that a completed deal changed the political landscape in ways that made an accusation-driven disruption harder to execute. Leora continued her library work, running 2 tracks simultaneously. The first was the incomplete history of the Veldmoor period. She was building a picture from fragments, assembling a case she couldn't yet prove but could increasingly see the shape of. The second was the sealed magic inside her. She had not accessed it in 14 years. Well, she didn't know if she still could, but if what was coming required it, she needed to understand what she was dealing with. She started small. In the privacy of her rooms, with the door locked and the fire burning and her glove removed, she sat and looked at the mark on her hand and tried to remember what it had felt like before the seal. The warmth, the particular quality of it, the way it had felt like something alive rather than something merely chemical. She remembered it distantly, the way you remember the details of a dream, impressionistic, real, but unreachable. Then one night, 12 days before the summit, she was sitting in exactly this configuration, hand bare, fire lit, attention focused inward, when she heard or felt or perceived in whatever sense applied to something that lived below ordinary sensation, a sound like ice cracking. Not ice, the seal. A single hairline fracture in a structure built 14 years ago by someone who hadn't wanted it to last forever, only long enough to serve its purpose. The fracture ran from one edge to the other and then held, the way a windshield holds after impact. Cracked through, structurally compromised, but not yet broken. The warmth that came through that crack was not large. It was barely a thread, but it was unmistakably, undeniably hers, and it was real. She closed her hand, put the glove back on, sat very still in the firelight for a long time. The seal was cracking on its own. She didn't know if that was connected to the approaching confrontation or simply to time. 14 years was a long time for any magical construction to hold under the pressure of what it was containing. But the direction was clear. Something that had been buried was working its way toward the surface, and whether she was ready for it or not, it was going to arrive. 3 days before the summit, Corvan came to her with his face arranged in the specific configuration it only achieved when the news was both significant and bad. The library records, he said, sitting down across from her in the small receiving room she'd been using for exactly these private meetings. I found the removal log. Who? She said. It wasn't a who, he said. Or not only a who. It was a when and a commission. He set a document on the table between them. 11 years ago, the year before Kael's father died, an administrative review was conducted of the palace historical records. The commission was chaired by... He stopped. Varric, she said. Corvan looked at her. Lord Varric, yes. The commission had broad authority to archive materials deemed, he read from his notes, sensitive, redundant, or potentially destabilizing to the territorial order. She held the document steady in her hands, keeping her grip even. The records were removed under an official process, a process chaired by Varric, authorized by the late king. Corvan paused. Who was at the time reportedly in declining health, and whose clarity of judgment in that final year before his death has been... Another pause, heavier. questioned in certain private assessments that I've only now seen. She looked at him. The late king fell in love. Corvin went very still. That's not something I can confirm or deny in any official capacity. I'm not asking in an official capacity, she said. I'm asking because I need to understand what I'm dealing with. He was quiet for a long moment. There were rumors, he said finally, when the late king's health declined. The court attributed it to ordinary illness. The circumstances were... He stopped again, and this time the stopping was not diplomatic restraint, but something more genuine. The discomfort of someone who has held a difficult piece of knowledge alone for a long time. Consistent, he said carefully, with certain historical accounts of the Dravenline's particular vulnerability. The curse. She thought about Kyle sitting across from her in his study, explaining the curse with the flat precision of someone who had already fully mapped what it would mean for his life, and had built his entire existence around not approaching the boundary. She thought about the evenings, the 2 months of them, the way the room felt different from the first day to the present, and the direction the difference was traveling. The late king's death, she said. Varric chaired the Records Commission the year before it. Yes. Varric knew the curse's history. He would have had access to the historical records before they were archived. Yes, and if those records show what I think they show, that the fire witches were victims rather than aggressors, that the purges were engineered, that the ban on enchantment work was built on a constructed narrative, then Varric's family, and the families allied with his, would have had direct involvement in engineering it. She kept her voice even. Which means the campaign to expose me isn't just about removing a queen with an inconvenient file. It's about preventing the exposure of something much older. Corvin picked up his document and held it against his chest like a shield that probably wouldn't help but was better than nothing. Your Majesty, he said quietly, I think we are in a very dangerous situation. Yes, she said. We are. She thanked him. She let him leave. She sat alone in the receiving room for perhaps 5 minutes, which was all she allowed herself for the simple experience of recognizing that the thing pressing from the inside was bigger than she'd managed it as. Bigger and older, and connected to a history she'd only seen the shadow of. Then she got up and went to Kyle. He already knew. Corvin had briefed him simultaneously, and when she walked into his study, the look on his face was the look of a man who has had a structure he built his life around challenged at its foundation. Tell me what you know, he said. She told him. Everything, now. The missing records, the commission, Varric, the engineered history, the fire witches who had been defending themselves rather than attacking, the 40-year-old lie that had been maintained by exactly the kind of people who benefited from its maintenance. She told him about the seal on her magic and the hairline crack that had appeared 3 days ago. She told him what she thought was going to happen at the summit. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the silence in the room had a density that was almost physical. If they make the accusation at the summit, he said, the law triggers. I can dismiss it afterward. I have the authority. But dismissing it in front of 100 pack witnesses, including 3 territorial lords whose compact we're still finalizing, costs me political capital I need for the trade negotiations. Yes. And if I dismiss it without full disclosure from you, the story continues. It doesn't die. It just goes back underground, where Varric and his allies can use it whenever they need leverage. Yes. He looked at her. The winter ice eyes were very direct. What do you want to do? She had thought about this. She had turned it over and examined it from every angle and come to the same place every time, the same place she'd been trying to get to since the auction hall. The place where the answer was hers to give, on her terms, in her time, not someone else's. I want to tell the story before they do, she said. He was quiet. Not the story they've been circulating, she continued. The real one. The complete one. At the summit, in front of all of them, I want to put the missing history on the table and let it be seen for what it is. You'd be exposing yourself. I'd be choosing to expose myself, she said, which is different. The law. The law was built on the lie, she said. If we can demonstrate that in the same room where the accusation would be made, we change the legal question from, is she a fire witch, to, is a law built on manufactured history legitimate? Those are not the same question. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. The most complex expression she'd seen him wear, layered in a way she was still learning to read. You'd be standing in front of 100 of the most powerful alphas in the Northern Territories, he said, unmasking yourself, owning a mark that 40 years of law says should be reported, with the only defense being a reconstructed history from a misfiled letter and archival gaps. Yes, she said. If it doesn't work, it will work, she said. Not with the bravado of someone who couldn't see the odds, but with the particular quality of certainty she developed by being accurate more often than not. Because the truth works when you give it enough room. He stood up and came around the desk and stood in front of her, and he looked at her, at the hood, at the shadow where her face was, at the hand she held at her sides with the glove on the marked one, and she saw what was underneath his expression more clearly than she'd ever seen it. I'm not going to let you stand in that room alone, he said. You're the king, she said. You'll be at the table. I'm going to be standing next to you, he said. It was not a statement about position. It was something else entirely, and they both knew it, and the weight of the room shifted around the knowing. She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to for its practical purposes. Kyle, she said, when this is over, she stopped. When this is over, he said quietly, we'll have a different conversation. She nodded. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, whatever happens at the summit, I need you to know that this was the best thing I could have done with what happened to me. The marriage? He said. All of it, she said. The auction, the contract, the evenings. A pause. You. She left before he could answer. Standing in the corridor, in the quiet stone passage of Iron Spire with the mountain pressing its mass above her, she pressed her gloved hand to her chest and felt, through 2 layers of fabric, the heat of the fracturing seal. Warmer than yesterday, the crack wider, the fire on the other side of it pressing with increasing insistence against the wall that had been holding it back for 14 years. The summit was in 3 days, and somewhere in this palace, Varric was already preparing his accusation. She unclenched her fist. Let the fire press where it would. She was done being afraid of what she was born to be. The night before the summit, she woke at 3 a.m. from a dead sleep to find her marked hand blazing with heat through the glove. The seal not cracked anymore, but fracturing continuously, running itself toward collapse with the inexorable logic of a dam reaching the end of its capacity. She sat up in the dark bedroom and pulled the glove off and looked at the mark. It was lit. Not glowing, not visibly, not the way a lamp glows. But to her, to whatever sense she had that perceived it, it was alive and burning and entirely, completely awake. And the wall her father had built around it 14 years ago was coming down tonight whether she was ready for it or not. She pressed her hand flat against the stone floor. The stone didn't burn. She breathed. She thought, not yet, not tonight. 3 more days, then she thought, 2 more days. The fire listened. It pulled back to its hairline. It waited, the way she had learned to wait. Not gone, not extinguished, but held in the fist of her intention, banked and ready. She put the glove back on. She lay back down. She did not sleep again until the sky outside began to gray. The morning of the summit arrived the way hard things always arrive, with complete indifference to whether you were ready for them. Leora dressed in the dark before the household staff came to help her, which was her habit and had become understood as her preference. She dressed carefully, methodically, the way she did everything that mattered. Dark gray wool, well cut, the kind of garment that communicated authority without demanding attention. She put the glove on her marked hand. She pulled the hood up. She stood in front of the cold mirror in her dressing room and looked at the silhouette she made, still cloaked, still hidden, the shadow where a face should be. And she thought, with the calm precision of someone who has already decided and is now simply executing, this is the last morning, this is what I look like. After today, one way or another, the hood was coming down. She ate breakfast alone, reading through her notes one final time, the misfiled letter, the archival gaps she'd mapped in the library catalog, the financial records she'd traced from the palace administrative files, the names and dates and amounts that formed when laid in sequence, a picture entirely different from the official one. She had organized it into the kind of argument she was best at, clean, undeniable, built from the opponent's own evidence rather than her own assertion. Marin appeared at 7 with the day's schedule and the careful expression of someone who understood something important was happening and had chosen to express her support through flawless logistical execution. "The summit convenes at 9, Marin said. "The King's party will form in the main hall at 8:30. "I'll be there," Leora said. "The Greywood delegation arrived last night." A pause. "Lord Varric's party arrived early this morning. He brought 4 additional advisors not listed on the original attendance register." Leora looked up. 4. "Legal advisors," Marin said, precisely, without editorializing. "All 4 are specialists in territorial contract law." She held Marin's gaze. "He's planning to make it formal today." "That would be my assessment," Marin said. Leora nodded once. "Thank you, Marin." Marin set the schedule down and moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused, which was unusual. Marin did not pause at thresholds. She was a woman who moved through doors with conviction. "Your Majesty," she said, without turning around, "I have served this palace for 22 years. I served the late king and his father before him, and I have seen a great many queens attempt to hold ground in rooms designed to take it from them." Another pause. "None of them came to the library at midnight on their first night here." She left. Leora sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her notes and went to meet her husband. The summit hall was the largest room in Ironspire, a great vaulted chamber on the palace's ground floor, its ceiling supported by massive iron-banded columns, its walls hung with the territorial banners of every pack in the northern frontier. Long tables had been arranged in a horseshoe configuration, with the king's table at the closed end and the pack lords' tables running outward in descending order of seniority. Places had been set for 94 attendees. Leora had been in the room twice before, once to walk its dimensions, once to sit in it alone and listen to the way sound moved through the space, which was information that turned out to matter more than she'd expected. The room filled quickly after the doors opened at 8:50. Pack lords she recognized from Corvan's briefings took their assigned places, accompanied by their seconds and advisors. The Greywood delegation sat at the second table to the left. Their senior representative, a solid, gray-bearded alpha named Counselor Brennan, reviewing documents with the focused attention of someone expecting the day to be complicated. The Ashvale contingent sat across from them. The Thornfield Collective's representatives, the smallest of the 3 compact territories, occupied the table nearest the door. Varric arrived last, before Kyle, which was a deliberate piece of staging. Arriving after the room had filled meant every eye was on you when you entered, and Varric understood theatrical timing the way he understood most political tools, instinctively and without needing to think about it. He came with his 4 legal advisors arranged behind him, and he took his seat at the senior pack lord's position to the right of the king's table with the settled authority of a man who had been occupying important chairs for decades and expected to continue doing so. He looked across the room at Leora. She looked back. His expression said, "Today." Hers said, "Yes." Then Kyle entered, and the room stood. He was in formal dress today. Black, as always, but the kind of black that had been constructed by someone who understood that simplicity in the right hands was more powerful than ornamentation. The silver signet, no other jewelry. He walked to his chair at the king's table and remained standing until the room had resettled, and then he sat, and the summit began. Leora was seated to his right. The first 2 hours were formal business, territorial reports, tribute summaries, border updates from the outer settlements. Leora listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention she gave things she needed to understand completely before she acted, and she tracked the room simultaneously. Who deferred to whom, who avoided whose eye, who had formed clusters before the session began that suggested prior coordination. Varric's 4 legal advisors had been given seats along the wall rather than at the table, which was slightly irregular for senior advisors, which meant Varric had arranged it deliberately. They were positioned for visibility, so that their presence would be noticed and its implication understood. The trade compact negotiations came up in the second hour, and this was where the morning's first test arrived. Aldrich presented the proposed compact terms with the careful neutrality of a man walking a rope between 2 very different outcomes. The The terms were reasonable. Leora and Kyle had worked through them over 5 evenings, refining the language until it was precise enough to hold and flexible enough not to break. Limited enchantment licensing for non-fire magical categories in the Greywood, Ashvale, and Thornfield territories. Council oversight. Royal Charter review annually. The winter trade routes reopened, the frontier economy given room to breathe. Councillor Brennan of the Greywood listened to the presentation with his gray-bearded face, doing very little. When Aldrich finished, he looked at the document copy in front of him for a long moment. The enchantment licensing categories, Brennan said. They exclude firework. They do, Aldrich confirmed. Why? It was a direct question, and it was not hostile. It was the question of a pragmatic man who wanted to understand the logic of the restriction before he decided whether to accept it. Leora watched Kale absorb it and make a small fractional movement that she had learned to read as your floor. She leaned forward. Because the legal structure for firework is currently governed by a 40-year statute that hasn't been reviewed since it was passed, she said, addressing Brennan directly. Reopening that statute is a separate process from this compact, and a larger one. The compact is designed to address the immediate economic need. The statute is a question for the full council. Brennan looked at her. He was the first senior pack lord outside of the council chamber who had heard her speak in a formal context, and she could see him recalibrating, adjusting the version of the queen he'd arrived with against the one currently speaking to him. And the statute review, he said. Is that on the council's agenda? It will be, she said. Varric moved. It was a small movement, a shift in his chair, a straightening of his posture, but in the way that small movements in very still rooms carry enormous weight. The room registered it. Perhaps, Varric said, in the smooth, reasonable tone he used when he was building toward something, before the council commits to any review of the fire statute, the summit might benefit from addressing a matter of considerable relevance to that discussion. The room went quiet in a very specific way. Kale looked at Varric. His face was entirely still. The Queen, Varric continued with the same smooth reasonableness, has been an active participant in the development of these compact terms. Her influence on the Council's direction over the past 2 months has been significant. He paused. Given that, the summit's members are entitled to understand the nature of the restrictions on Her Majesty's historical file, particularly as they may bear directly on the question of whether her involvement in fire statute discussions represents a conflict of Lord Varric. Kyle's voice was quiet and absolute. Choose your next sentence carefully. Varric did not choose silence. He had 4 legal advisors along the wall and a room full of witnesses and a 40-year-old law on his side, and he had been building to this moment for 2 months, and he was not a man who retreated from built moments. The territorial reporting statute, he said, requires that any person bearing the mark of fire witchcraft be reported to the Crown within 72 hours of identification. I am formally notifying this summit that I have reason to believe the current Queen Consort bears such a mark, and that the restriction on her historical file was entered for the purpose of preventing its identification at the time of the mating contract. I am requesting a formal review. The room's silence had weight now. It pressed down on everything. Leora felt the seal in her hand pulse once, hard, hot, the fire behind it pressing forward with sudden urgency. She pressed her gloved hand flat against the table and held it, the way she'd held it in the dark of her bedroom, the way she'd held everything that had needed holding for 24 years. Not yet. She stood up. Every eye in the room was already on her, but standing changed the geometry. It made her the center of the space rather than a point at its edge, and the room organized itself around her the way rooms organize around the thing that is happening, rather than the things waiting for it. Lord Varric is correct, she said. The silence became a different thing entirely. She reached up and pushed the hood back. She had known, intellectually, that this moment would be significant. She had not known, not entirely, what it would feel like, the specific quality of exposure, the physical reality of 3 months of concealment ending in a single motion. The air on her face was cold and immediate. The light from the summit hall's high windows fell across her directly for the first time, and 94 people saw her face. She had her mother's face. She knew this from a single portrait she'd found in her father's house at 12 years old, before he'd taken it down and locked it away. Dark hair, wide-set eyes, a mouth set in the particular way of people who have learned to use expression precisely rather than freely. She was, by any ordinary accounting, entirely unremarkable in appearance, not the deformity the rumors had promised, not the burned ruin the more dramatic versions had described. Just a woman's face, composed and direct, looking out at the room, and on the back of her ungloved right hand, now raised and open and entirely visible, the mark. The brand that was not a brand. It had never been burned, never been applied. It had simply appeared, the way fire appears, from within. It was the shape of a flame, elongated, its base at her wrist, its point reaching toward her middle finger's first knuckle. In the morning light of the summit hall, it was faintly luminous, not blazing, not dramatic, but undeniably present, undeniably alive. She held it up so the room could see it. "Lord Varick's report is accurate," she said. Her voice was steady, and it carried in this room the way she'd known it would. She had studied the acoustics. "I bear the mark of fire witchcraft. I have borne it since I was 6 years old. I entered my mating contract with a restricted file precisely because this mark would have triggered the reporting statute and prevented the contract from being executed." She let that settle for a moment. "Everything Lord Varick has said about me is true." Varick's expression had moved through surprise and was now recalibrating rapidly. This was not the shape of the moment he'd planned. He'd planned an accusation, a denial, an investigation, the grinding machinery of legal process working against her over time. He had not planned this. He didn't know yet whether what she'd given him was surrender or something else. "However," she said, she reached under the table and brought out the folder she'd placed there an hour before the summit began. She opened it and removed the first document, the misfiled letter, and placed it on the table where the nearest pack lords could see it. "The territorial reporting statute was passed 40 years ago," she said, as a direct response to the Veldmoor massacres. The justification for the statute was that fire witches had attacked and destroyed the eastern quarter of Veldmoor's trade settlement, killing 47 people, and that the Crown's failure to identify and contain fire witchcraft in advance had enabled the attack. She looked around the room. This is the story every person in this room was taught. It is the story written into the statute's preamble. It is the story that has governed the Northern Territory's relationship to magical practice for 4 decades. She lifted the letter. This document was written in the 41st year of the previous king's reign by the Crown's own historical archivist, addressed to the then chief advisor of the Territorial Records Commission. She kept her voice level, factual, the way she'd kept it through every council meeting and every confrontation, and every morning she'd gotten up in a room that was too small and kept going anyway. It documents the archivist's concern that commission records related to the Veldmoor period contained evidence that the fire, the one attributed to the witches, was started by persons external to the witch settlement. Specifically, that the settlement itself was attacked first, and that the fire was the witches' defensive response. She set the letter down. The archivist requested that the evidence be reviewed before the statute was finalized. She removed the second document, the commission removal log. This is the administrative record of the Territorial Records Commission's review of the Palace Historical Archives, conducted 11 years ago. The commission had authority to archive materials deemed sensitive or destabilizing. The commission was chaired by Lord Varick. She placed it on the table. The records the archivist referenced in this letter, the original documentation of the Veldmoor period, were archived under this commission's authority. They are no longer accessible in the palace library. The room was so quiet she could hear the fire in the wall sconces. She looked at Varick. He was looking at the documents. His expression had changed. It was not the expression of a man who had been surprised. It was the expression of a man who had known something like this was possible, who had taken steps to prevent it, and was now processing the fact that the steps had not been sufficient. She addressed the room. "I am not asking this summit to overturn the reporting statute today," she said. "I am not asking to be exempted from it. I am asking that before any formal review proceeds, the evidence underlying the statute be subject to the same scrutiny as the report Lord Varick has just entered." She looked at Councillor Brennan of the Greywood, who had been watching her with the focused attention of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew about this morning. Because if the statute was built on a version of events that the Crown's own archivist believed was incomplete, if the fear that drove 4 decades of policy was engineered rather than earned, then we are not having a conversation about one woman's mark. We are having a conversation about what this kingdom has cost itself and its people by believing a lie long enough to build a law on it. She sat down. The room did not erupt the way the auction hall had erupted. It did something different. It moved in the particular way that rooms move when a significant number of people are simultaneously revising their understanding of something. There was the sound of it, low, collective, the murmur of thought rather than reaction. Brennan was the first to speak. "The archived records," he said, addressing the table at large. "Can they be retrieved?" "The Commission archived them," Kael said, from his position to her left. His voice was entirely controlled. The Commission's authority was to archive, not destroy. The records exist. He looked at Varric, and will be retrieved. Varric's legal advisors along the wall had gone into rapid, low-voiced conference. Varric himself was still looking at the documents on the table. She watched something move across his face, the specific sequence of a man calculating whether the ground he'd chosen to stand on still existed and arriving at an answer he didn't like. "The archivist's letter," one of the legal advisors said, standing, "may not constitute sufficient—" "The archivist's letter," Kyle said, with a quietness that was more authoritative than volume would have been, "is a document produced by an officer of this Crown, expressing concern about evidence in the Crown's own records, addressed to a commission whose chair is present in this room. It is sufficient to require a response." He looked at the advisor. "Sit down." The advisor sat. Brennan looked at Leora. He was a man of 60-something years, shaped by the specific character of the northern frontier, pragmatic, blunt, not sentimental, and deeply invested in the particular kind of fairness that communities develop when they've had to solve problems without anyone coming to solve them from outside. "Your Majesty," he said, "in the Greywood we have a saying, the ice doesn't care what story you tell about it. It's still ice." She looked at him. "What you've put on this table," he continued, "is either the beginning of a very long process that may or may not go where you're pointing." He paused. "Or it's the ice, meaning we can tell whatever story we want, but what's in those archived records is what it is, regardless." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." He nodded, once, with the slow deliberateness of a man making a decision. Then he looked at the compact terms document still in front of him. He picked up the pen. He signed it. The Ashvale representative looked at Brennan for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and signed. The Thornfield Collective's representative signed without pausing. Varric watched this happen with the expression of a man watching a wall he'd built over decades develop cracks faster than he could respond to them. Otet. The summit recessed for midday meal with the kind of tension that doesn't leave a room just because the people have... It stays in the air, in the arrangement of half-empty chairs, in the documents left on tables that nobody has been willing to move. Leora walked out of the hall without the hood. This was the first time she had moved through the palace uncovered, and she felt it. The quality of the air on her face, the particular exposure of being seen in a way that was complete rather than partial. The staff who passed her in the corridor outside the hall stopped. Not obtrusively. There were no gasps, no pointed stares. But they stopped, and they looked, and several of them held her gaze for a moment before dropping it, which she understood as a form of acknowledgement. Marin met her outside the hall doors. She looked at Leora's face for a moment, just a moment, professional and complete, and then she said, "I'll have water sent to the private reception room." "Thank you, Marin." She had been in the reception room for perhaps 10 minutes, sitting very still with a glass of water and the specific kind of tired that comes from sustained intensity rather than physical effort, when the door opened and Kael came in. He looked at her face. She let him. This was different from the summit hall. Not a deliberate act of exposure before an audience, but something private, the actual first time. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from across the carriage a lifetime ago, trying to locate by sound alone the person behind the voice. Except now there was nothing between them, no hood, no shadow, and what he found was her face looking back at him with the same directness she'd given everything in this palace from the first night. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You look like your voice sounds." She almost laughed. It surprised her. The loosening of something she hadn't known was held that tightly, the release of it. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, he said. But the almost smile was fully present this time, and it stayed, and it changed his face into something she hadn't seen before. Open, undefended, the specific expression of a man who has stopped performing control because the person in front of him doesn't require the performance. She thought, there it is, the thing she'd been tracking for 3 months through layers of precision and deliberate distance. The thing that was not coldness, but its opposite. A warmth held so carefully under containment that the containment had started to look like the thing itself. He crossed the room and sat next to her rather than across from her, which was new. Close enough that the quality of the air between them was different. Varek's legal advisors have filed a procedural hold on the reporting review, he said. Buying time. Let them buy it, she said. Every hour we spend retrieving the archives is an hour the evidence exists in the world outside that commission room. The hold is a delay, not a reversal. Brennan has already sent a message to his territory, Cale said. He wants to start the process of reapplying for enchantment work licenses before the ink on the compact is dry. He's practical, she said. I like him. He told me, Kyle said with a particular tone, that the Queen was the most competent person in that room today. What did you tell him? I told him I'd been aware of that for approximately 2 months and was glad the rest of the room was catching up. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has said something true and is not entirely sure what to do about having said it. You're not good at this, she said. At what? At the part that comes after the precision, she said. The part that doesn't have a policy framework. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I'm not. Neither am I, she said. Something settled between them. Not the weight of everything that hadn't been said, but the possibility of eventually saying it, which was different, and in its way, larger. The archived records, she said, pulling them back to the practical because it was where she was most fluent when things got too close. How long to retrieve them? Corvan has people working on it now. The commission archives are in the Eastern Storage Vault. Everything archived under that process has to be there by charter, days, not weeks. Varek will try to interfere. He can try. Something in Kyle's tone had changed from its summit register, less royal authority and more personal resolve, which was somehow quieter and considerably more dangerous. He removed records from my mother's library. He used my father's declining health to run a historical revisionist commission, and he's been using a manufactured story to keep 40 years of my kingdom's population afraid of its own resources. A pause. I've been patient with Varek because he's been useful and because the council functions better with his cooperation than without it. That patience has a new boundary. She nodded. Then she heard it. Outside the reception room, in the corridor, the sound of rapid footsteps. Not running, but close to it. The kind of movement that meant someone had news they'd been told to deliver quickly. The door opened and Corvin appeared, slightly flushed, with the expression of a man who had assembled a complicated picture very fast and was still processing the edges of it. Your Majesties, he said. The Eastern Storage Vault. He stopped, organized himself. We found the archived records, all of them, intact, indexed, still in their original commission folders. Leora was already on her feet. What do they show? Corvan looked at her, then at Kyle, then back at her. What you thought they would show, he said. It's all there. The witness accounts, the investigation reports, the original Crown investigators' findings. He swallowed. The fire was started from outside the witch settlement. The investigators' report says it clearly. External accelerants, directional burn pattern, inconsistent with an interior origin. The witches didn't start it, he paused. But it goes further than that. There are names. The people who organized the attack. The land purchase agreements that followed within weeks. The redistribution of the witches' territorial holdings. Another pause. Varek's grandfather chaired the consortium. The room was very quiet. His grandfather organized the massacre, Kyle said. Organized or financed, Corvan said carefully. The records indicate both. Leora thought about 40 years. She thought about a law built on a lie. and a kingdom shaped around that law, and generations of people afraid of their own capabilities because the fear served someone else's interests. She thought about the seal on her hand, her father's seal, built to hide what she was, to protect his own silence about what his family had gained from the same historical machinery. She thought about the fire behind the seal, patient and alive and entirely ready. "Corvin," she said, "secure the vault, full guard. Nothing leaves and nothing enters without the king's direct order." "Already done," Corvin said with the mild satisfaction of a man who had anticipated the instruction. She looked at Kael. He was looking back at her with an expression she had no catalog entry for yet, something that combined the precision and the warmth in the same moment, undivided, the two things she'd been seeing separately finally occupying the same face at the same time. "What do you need from me?" he said. She thought about the summit hall waiting to reconvene. She thought about Varrick's legal advisors and their procedural hold. She thought about Brennan's signed compact and the Ashvale and Thornfield signatures beside it, and the particular arithmetic of a room where the momentum had shifted and the people who needed to feel which way the wind was blowing were already adjusting. "I need you to reconvene the summit this afternoon," she said, "and I need Corvin to bring the archived records to the hall." "All of them?" "Enough of them," she said. "The investigation report, the land purchase agreements, the consortium documentation." She met his eyes. "I want Varrick to be in the room when it's read." Kael held her gaze. "He'll deny it." "He can deny whatever he wants," she said. "The records exist. They're in the Crown's possession. They were produced by the Crown's own investigators, and they have 94 witness signatures on the attendance record of the summit where they're introduced." She kept her voice level, but underneath it, for the first time in this palace, she let him hear what was actually there, the things she'd been running on since the auction hall, since the contract room, since the carriage going north through the dark. Denial is for people who haven't seen the ice yet. Once they've seen it, they can call it whatever they want. It's still ice. She was using Brennan's words. She knew he recognized it. The corner of his mouth moved. "The summit reconvenes at 3, he said. The afternoon session was not an eruption. It was something more deliberate than that, a controlled, methodical unbuilding, the kind that is more durable than explosion because it works from the foundations rather than the surface. Corvin read from the archived investigation report in the flat, careful voice of a man ensuring that every word landed precisely. The room listened with the specific quality of attention that people give information that is rearranging their understanding of something they thought they knew completely. Varrick's face, across the horseshoe table, went through several stages. Denial. The first instinct, visible in the tightening of his jaw and the way his eyes moved to his legal advisors. Calculation. The rapid reassessment, the weighing of positions, the search for a counter-argument in a landscape that was no longer what he'd mapped. And finally, underneath both of those, something that was not quite shame, but occupied the same neighborhood. The expression of a man who has lived his entire life inside a structure built by someone else's crime and chosen not to look too closely at the foundations. When Corvin finished reading, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Brennan said, addressing the summit in his Greywood bluntness, "I want to understand what we're being told. The law that's been governing magical practice in these territories for 40 years was written in response to an event that the Crown's own investigators determined was not what the law says it was." "Yes," Kael said, "and the records demonstrating this were removed from the palace library under a commission chaired by the man currently sitting at this table." "Yes," Brennan looked at Varrick. "Lord Varrick," he said, with the directness of the frontier rather than the politeness of the court, "do you have anything to say?" Varrick was quiet for a long moment. His legal advisors had stopped conferring. The procedural hold they'd filed was, everyone in the room understood, no longer the operative consideration. "My grandfather's actions," Varrick said finally, "are not my responsibility." "No one is making you responsible for your grandfather," Leora said. "We're making you responsible for removing the records that documented them." The room felt the distinction land. Varrick looked at her. He looked at her face, her uncovered face, for the first time, with the mark visible on her raised hand and her eyes holding his with complete steadiness. and something in his expression shifted in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or calculation. It was simpler than that. It was the specific look of a man encountering for the first time the thing he's been afraid of, and discovering that his fear was not shaped correctly. She was not a monster. She was not a curse. She was a woman with a mark on her hand and 4 months of evidence on the table in front of her, and she was looking at him as if she had already decided that she was going to outlast him, and he was only now understanding that she was right. He said nothing else. It was Kael who concluded it, not with drama, but with the flat administrative authority of a king issuing a decision that was final and knew it. The summit will note that the archived records have been recovered and will be subject to full council review, he said. The reporting statute is suspended pending that review. The trade compact is signed and in effect as of today. Lord Varick is hereby removed from the council pending an investigation into the commission's archival process. He looked at the room. This summit is adjourned. The noise that followed was significant but not chaotic. The sound of 94 people adjusting to a new arrangement of the world, which is always louder than people expect, but never quite loud enough to cover everything that's just happened. Brennan stood as the room began to move and caught Leora's eye across the tables. He nodded at her, once deliberate, the particular nod of a frontierman acknowledging someone who has done something he respects. She nodded back. She was still sitting when Kael came around the table to her. He didn't say anything. He stood next to her chair, close, and she could feel the quality of his presence the way she'd felt the mountain in the dark. As a mass, as a fact, as something that everything else in the landscape had to account for. She looked up at him. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's different." She thought about the seal in her hand, still fractured, still pressing, the fire behind it aware of everything that had happened today, with the particular awareness of something very old that has been patient for a very long time. "Tonight," she said, "I'm going to try to break the seal completely." He looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face, openly, with the full warmth of him finally present without armor. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded. She stood up. The summit hall was emptying around them, the territorial banners hanging still in the post-session quiet, the afternoon light coming through the high windows at an angle that turned the stone floor amber and gold. Outside, she knew, the city was going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of what had shifted in this room in the last 6 hours. She walked out of the summit hall without a hood, and the cold palace air was on her face, and the mark on her hand was warm, and for the first time in 24 years, Leora Vale did not feel like something that needed to be hidden. She felt like something that was finally, completely awake. And that night, she intended to prove it. The preparations were simple because she made them simple. She had learned over a lifetime that the most important things rarely required elaborate staging. She asked Marin to clear the evening's household schedule and ensure that her wing remained undisturbed. She asked Kyle to come at 9. She moved the furniture in her sitting room to the walls, leaving the stone floor open and bare. And she built the fire in the grate higher than usual because she understood, in the specific way she understood things that lived below language, that fire recognized fire. She sat in the center of the cleared floor and waited. He arrived at 9 exactly. She had learned his punctuality was not habit, but respect, the specific form his attention took when something mattered to him. He came in without knocking, which they had moved past somewhere around week 6, and he looked at the cleared room and the high fire and the way she was sitting, cross-legged on the stone, her marked hand uncovered and resting palm up on her knee. And he sat down against the wall without being asked, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the space the work required. "Tell me what to expect," he said. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I've never broken a seal before. I've never had access to what's on the other side of it." She looked at her hand. The mark was luminous in the firelight, more alive than it had ever been. The fracture lines in the seal running the full length of it now, a web of cracks through which the warmth seeped continuously. "What I know is that it's been building pressure for weeks. The summit today," she paused. "The truth coming out did something. I could feel it. Like the seal recognizes the difference between hiding and choosing, between concealment and disclosure," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. My father built the seal to keep me hidden. The conditions it was built under were fear. His fear. My fear. She turned her hand over, looking at the back of it, the mark that had been her earliest memory of being wrong and was now the most honest thing about her. I'm not afraid anymore. Cale was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? She thought about this. Just stay, she said. That's easy, he said. She turned her hand palm up again, closed her eyes, and went inward. The seal had the texture, in whatever sense applied to things perceived below ordinary consciousness, of old stone. Dense, deliberate, built by someone who knew what they were doing. She could feel its architecture the way she could feel the architecture of the palace around her, the weight and placement of each element, the logic of how they connected. Her father had not built it himself. He wouldn't have known how. Someone had built it for him. Someone who understood fire magic well enough to construct a containment that could hold for 14 years. She moved along the fracture lines, not forcing them, but following where they'd already opened. The metaphor that came to her was water finding its course, not breaking the stone, but moving through the cracks that were already there, finding the path the pressure had been carving since the day the seal first began to fail. The first fracture opened fully, with a sensation like a door swinging on a hinge that had been rusted shut and was now finally, decisively, working. The warmth that came through it was immediate and real. Not heat in the atmospheric sense, not the warmth of fire as other people experienced it from the outside, but something interior and enormous, the difference between standing near a flame and being one. The second fracture. The third. She moved through them faster now, the seal's resistance decreasing as the structural integrity collapsed, each opening making the next easier the way truths work when they begin to be spoken. The first one is the hardest, and then the rest want to come. The last fracture ran the full width of the seal in a single motion, and then the wall came down. The fire that had been sealed inside her for 14 years arrived all at once. Cale had been watching. He saw her hand first, the mark blazing from within, not flickering but steady, the deep amber gold of banked coals rather than open flame. He saw it spread up her wrist, not burning, not consuming, but tracing the pathways of her as if illuminating what had always been there. The sitting room's temperature had risen perceptibly. The fire in the grate surged without being touched. Then she opened her eyes. They had changed. Not dramatically. Her eyes were still her eyes, the same direct dark gaze he'd spent 4 months learning to read. But there was something behind them now that hadn't been visible before, a quality of light that was not reflected but generated. And when she looked at him across the cleared floor, he understood for the first time with his whole body rather than just his intellect what she actually was. Not dangerous, not a threat, not the thing the old law had tried to make her, something ancient and alive and completely itself. Finally uncontained. Leora, he said, quietly. Just her name. She breathed out slowly, and the breath was warm in the cold room, and the light in her hand steadied from blazing to luminous, a thing under control rather than under pressure. She looked at her hands, both of them, marked and unmarked, with the specific expression of someone encountering themselves completely for the first time. Oh, she said, very quietly. Are you all right? She looked up at him. She stopped, started again. I've been carrying this my whole life, she said, sealed and compressed, and it's like I've been breathing half a breath for 24 years, and just now... She stopped again, and her composure, which was formidable and he had watched it hold against considerable pressure, developed a fracture of its own. Not dramatic. Just the particular quality of a face when something held very long is finally allowed to be set down. He crossed the floor and sat beside her, close, shoulder to shoulder on the bare stone. She didn't move away. He felt the warmth radiating from her. Not burning, nothing like the threatening heat the old stories described. It was the warmth of a fire you sit near in winter, the specific comfort of heat that is generous rather than consuming. It doesn't feel like what they said it would feel like, she said. The old stories about fire witches, they always made it sound like violence, like something destructive. She turned her marked hand over, watching the light in it pulse slowly with her heartbeat. It just feels like me. Bigger than I knew, but mine. The stories were written by the people who took their land, he said. She looked at him. The firelight caught her face, her actual face, open and present, the face he'd been permitted to see for the first time only hours ago and was now, he understood, going to spend a very long time learning. Yes, she said. They were. They sat in silence for a while, the fire in the grate and the warmth in her both steady and unhurried, and the night settled around Ironspire with the particular quiet of a place that has been through something significant and is now in the first hours of whatever comes next. He didn't say what was building in him yet. She didn't ask. But it was there, in the quality of the closeness, in the way neither of them moved apart, in the thing that had been growing in those evenings for 4 months, and was now, in a cleared room with the seal broken and the summit behind them, and no more strategic reasons to hold anything back, simply undeniable. They stayed there until the fire burned low. Asa. The curse came for him 3 weeks later. She should have anticipated it. She had known about the curse from the beginning, had read its history, understood its mechanism, tracked its logic through the Draven bloodline with the same methodical attention she'd given everything else in the palace library. She knew what triggered it. She had watched, over 4 months of evenings, in council chambers and cleared sitting room floors, exactly what was happening between them, with the accuracy of a woman who never permitted herself comfortable illusions. She knew. She had simply, without admitting it to herself in those precise terms, hoped. It started the way the old text said it would start, with the cold. Not the ordinary cold of the northern frontier, which was a fact of geography they both lived inside. This was interior cold, the specific cold that has no external source, that comes from within and radiates outward, that a king of the Draven line would recognize from family history the moment he felt it. Kale recognized it at breakfast, which was how she knew when it had begun. He came to his meal and he ate without his customary focus, and then he sat still in a way that was not his ordinary stillness, but something different, something careful. And when she looked at him across the table, he met her eyes with an expression that was the most completely open thing she had ever seen on his face, and said nothing. "When?" she asked. "This morning," he said. She kept her voice level. "How bad?" He placed his hand on the table between them, palm down. She could see it. Barely, but she could see it. The faint tracing of frost under his skin, the blue-white of it spreading from somewhere central and moving outward with the patience of something that believed in its eventual completion. She reached across and covered his hand with hers. The warmth in her surged toward him instinctively, and she felt the cold resist it. The ancient cold, the engineered cold, the curse built by a paranoid ancestor to ensure that love would always cost the thing it was most attached to. It was strong. Not strong enough to burn through, not yet, but strong enough to make clear that this was not going to be simple. "I need to know everything about it," she said. "Everything in the archives, every account, every record of how it progressed in your father and his father before him. I need to understand its structure." "Leora, we have time." She kept her hand over his. "It progressed slowly in the historical accounts. We have weeks, possibly longer, before it reaches critical." She held his gaze. "I'm not watching you die from something that was built by someone who's been dead for 200 years. I need you to give me the archives and give me the time to work." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think you can break it?" "I broke a seal that was built to hold for a lifetime," she said. "I put together a case from archival fragments that dismantled 40 years of policy in one afternoon." She kept her eyes on his, direct, entirely present. "I think I'm the most competent person in this kingdom for this specific problem." Something crossed his face. The full warmth, the undefended version, the thing she'd been watching come into the open incrementally since the first evening in his study and was now simply there, entire and unmanaged. "You are," he said. "You're the most competent person in this kingdom for most specific problems." "Then let me work," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "What do you need?" "The complete Draven family archive," she said. "Every record of the curse's manifestation. Any documentation of the original curse's casting. Who did it, how, what the specific mechanism was." She paused. And I need to talk to Corvan. If anyone in this palace has been quietly tracking the curse's history across Kael's reign, waiting for exactly this situation, it's him. Kael looked at her. You know, most people would be frightened right now. Most people haven't spent 24 years learning that the things they were told to be frightened of were constructed, she said. Corvan had, in fact, been tracking the curse's history, quietly, privately, with the anxious dedication of a man who had served the Draven line long enough to understand what its particular vulnerability meant for the kings he'd given his career to. He produced, when asked, a leather folder so full of accumulated documentation that it had developed a permanent expansion to its spine, and he handed it to Leora with the expression of a man who has been waiting for the right person to give this to for a very long time. She worked. For 10 days, she worked the way she worked best, with everything available to her spread out and organized, building from fragments toward the complete picture, treating the curse the way she'd treated the Veldmoor history, not as a fixed fact, but as a structure, something built by a specific person at a specific moment for specific reasons, which meant it had a logic, and logic could be understood, and understood things could be addressed. The curse's original caster had been a king named Aldrich Draven, 3 generations back from Kael's grandfather, a man the historical accounts described with considerable restraint as cautious and protective of stability, which Leora translated as paranoid and controlling. He had watched his father die of the curse, the genuine natural vulnerability that the Draven line carried in its blood, the way some families carried predispositions toward illness. And he had decided, with the specific logic of someone who believes that removing possibility is the same as removing danger, to formalize it. To take the natural vulnerability and make it architectural. To build it into the line so that every king after him would carry not just the susceptibility, but the guarantee. He had used a professional curse layer. The documentation was fragmentary but present, enough to understand the structure of what had been built. It was, she recognized with the particular satisfaction of someone who has found the organizing principle of a complicated problem, not entirely unlike a seal. Different in mechanism, vastly larger in scale. But the underlying logic was the same: containment through architecture, a structure built to prevent a specific thing from existing freely. And structures, as she now had extensive personal experience of, could be broken when you understood how they were built. The difference, the crucial difference, was that a seal could be broken from within. The person being sealed could, given enough time and the right conditions, fracture it with their own accumulated pressure. The curse was external. It couldn't be broken from inside Kael. It required an external source of the right kind of energy, applied with enough precision to dismantle the structure rather than simply push against it. She thought about fire. She thought about what fire actually was, in the elemental sense, not the surface phenomenon, not heat and light, but the underlying reality of it. Transformation. The rapid conversion of one state to another. The precise, specific consumption of a structure's components such that what existed before no longer exists in the same form. Fire didn't break things. Fire changed them. She went to find Kael. He was in the war room, which he'd been using more than his study recently. She suspected because the maps gave him something to do with his hands, something to organize and plan, while the cold in his chest worked its slow expansion. He was standing at the table when she came in, and he looked up with the expression he'd developed over the past 10 days, present, controlled, carrying something heavy, and refusing to show how heavy it was. She set the Corvan folder on the table. "I know how to break it," she said. He looked at her. "Aldrich Draven used a curse layer," she said. "Professional, skilled. The documentation is incomplete but sufficient to understand the mechanism. The curse is architectural. It's a structure built around a natural vulnerability in the Draven bloodline, reinforcing and formalizing it." She turned to the page she'd marked. "It's designed to activate on emotional trigger, the specific emotional frequency of love, because Aldrich understood that vulnerability would be the vector, and he wanted the trigger to be reliable. The moment the emotional condition is met, the structure activates, and the natural susceptibility does the rest." "So the structure uses my own biology against me," he said. "Yes, which means pushing back against it from within is like trying to fight your own circulatory system." She met his eyes. But the structure itself is external. It was laid by someone outside the Draven line, which means it has seams, places where the external construction meets the natural underlying biology. The seam is where it's weakest. He was very still. And you can find the seam. I found the seams in my own seal, she said. This is bigger, older, more sophisticated, but the principle is the same. I follow the fracture lines in the architecture until I find where the construction becomes biology, and I apply the right kind of energy to the junction. Fire, he said. Transformative fire, she said. Not heat, not the surface quality. The deeper thing, the conversion property. She paused. I've been practicing with it for 10 days. I understand what I have access to better than I did when the seal broke. And what I have access to is precisely what this structure's weakest point is vulnerable to. He looked at her for a long moment. How certain are you? She had been asking herself this for 10 days. She gave him the honest answer. Certain enough, she said. Not absolutely. But the alternative is watching the ice reach your heart, and I'm not able to do that. Something moved across his face. The full, undefended expression, and beneath it something that had been building since before he knew what it was building toward. I should tell you something, he said. Kyle, I should tell you before we do this, he said, with the specific quiet of someone who has decided that precision is more important than protection. Because I want you to know that I said it before the outcome was certain, not after, when it's easy. Now, when it still costs something to say. He held her gaze. I love you. I have been aware of loving you for approximately 6 weeks and have been managing the awareness with varying degrees of success. The ghost of the almost smile, barely there, underlaid with something entirely serious. Apparently I wasn't careful enough. She looked at him for a moment. You weren't, she agreed. She crossed the room and she put her marked hand against his chest where the cold was deepest, and she felt it immediately. The structure of the curse, enormous and ancient and deliberate, pressing its ice outward from the center of him. And beneath it, the seam she'd identified in the documentation, the thin line where 200-year-old construction met the living reality of a man who had been built to be vulnerable to this, and was now, entirely and irreversibly, in the condition the curse had been designed to punish. She closed her eyes. She found the fire, not the surface warmth, not the light that had been visible in her hand since the seal broke. The deeper thing, the transformative core of it, the thing that changed states, that took what was built and unmade it at the molecular level of reality. She had found it in pieces over 10 days of practice. She had understood its shape. She had understood how to direct it. She directed it now at the seam in the curse's architecture, and she pressed. The cold surged in response. It recognized the threat, and it mobilized, the way any defensive structure mobilizes when its integrity is challenged. And for a moment, the cold and the fire were in direct contact, and the quality of that contact was extraordinary. Not pain exactly, but pressure beyond ordinary sensation. The specific clash of two organized systems, each committed to their own continuation, and she was one of them, and she held her ground. She followed the seam. The curse was old and certain of itself, the way things built by certainty always are. It had been right for 200 years. It had killed 2 kings of the Draven line. It had shaped the entire emotional landscape of a bloodline, and it had no framework for encountering something like her. Something that had been told since birth what it was, and had concluded, through patient accumulated evidence, that the telling was wrong. She pressed harder. She felt Kael's hand come up and cover hers against his chest. Both his hands, holding hers in place, the cold in him, and the fire in her, in direct contact with nothing between them, and she felt him make a choice in the way you feel someone make a choice when you're close enough. A conscious, deliberate leaning into the thing rather than bracing against it. The seam gave, not all at once. First a fracture, a single running crack in the curse's architecture, the way the first fracture had appeared in her seal, then a second. Then the structure was running fractures faster than it could compensate, and the cold was losing its organized quality, becoming fragmented, the ice in him breaking into pieces that her fire converted as each one separated from the whole. The final collapse was not dramatic. It was complete. The structure came down the way old buildings come down when their foundations fail. Entirely. and then all at once, leaving nothing behind that resembled what had been there. The cold in Kael's chest simply stopped. The silence after was profound. She became aware gradually of her own heartbeat, of his, of the fact that her hand was no longer pressed against cold, but against warmth. The ordinary warmth of a living body, the warmth she'd felt when she sat beside him on the cleared floor and the fire burned low, the warmth that was simply him, unencumbered, alive. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her. His eyes were... The winter ice color was still there, but the quality had changed, the way ice changes quality when winter is ending. Not gone, but not the dominant condition anymore. Something behind it, warmer, entirely unguarded. "Well," he said. His voice was slightly unsteady, which was the first time she'd heard it that way in 4 months of close attention, and she found it the most significant sound she'd ever heard him make. "You were certain enough." She breathed out. Her hand was still against his chest. Neither of them moved it. "The curse," she said. "Is it gone?" he said. He said it with the careful specificity of someone testing a word they've never been able to use before. "It's gone." He put his hand flat over hers. All of it. She felt the truth of it through his skin. No ice, no architecture, no ancient construction waiting to activate at the worst possible moment. Just his heartbeat, steady and warm and entirely free. She let herself feel, for the first time since Marin had brought her his hands across the breakfast table with the frost visible in them, the full weight of the fear she'd been carrying for 10 days. She let herself feel it because it was over and she could afford to now, and because she had learned that the things you don't allow yourself to feel don't go away. They become the next sealed room, the next wall, the next thing you have to break down later with more force than it would have taken if you just let it move through you when it arrived. She felt it. Then she set it down. He put his arms around her. She let him. The warmth between them, hers and his, fire and the absence of ice, was the most uncomplicated thing she had felt in 24 years. In the weeks that followed, Ironspire changed in ways that were both visible and structural. The archived records were reviewed by a commission of 5, 2 council members, the Greywoods Councillor Brennan, the Crown Archivist, and a territorial historian whose specialty was the pre-purge period. Their report, published 40 days after the summit, confirmed everything. The Veldmoor fire had been set from outside the witch settlement. The purge that followed had been organized by a consortium of territorial lords whose families had subsequently acquired the witches' land, and the legislation that had governed magical practice for 4 decades had been built on a foundation that the Crown's own investigators had, at the time, identified as compromised. The report was 42 pages. Kael had 300 copies made and distributed to every major pack in the Northern Territories. Varric resigned from the council before the investigation concluded, which the legal framework interpreted as an implicit acknowledgement, insufficient for formal prosecution without evidence of direct personal action, but sufficient to permanently remove his family's influence from the territorial power structure. His allies on the council requested reassignment to minor administrative positions. The requests were granted because Kael was not a man who confused mercy with weakness. The reporting statute was formally suspended by royal order, while the new magical practice framework was drafted. The drafting commission included 3 people: Aldrich, the trade commissioner, Councillor Brennan, representing the frontier territories, and Leora. She was the lead author. The framework they produced was not a simple repeal. It was a restructuring. Clear categories of regulated practice versus prohibited practice, with firework occupying its own specific tier: legal, supervised, requiring licensing, and subject to safety protocols developed in consultation with practitioners rather than in opposition to them. The philosophy behind it was the philosophy she'd developed over a lifetime of working with incomplete information. Build the structure around what you actually know, not what you've been told to be afraid of. It passed the council unanimously. Brennan, voting yes, said, "Took 40 years, but the ice broke eventually." She thought, fire helps. Edron Vale came to Ironspire 4 months after the summit. He came without announcement, which was itself a statement about how much had changed. A man with no pack, no land, no political relevance, arriving at the palace of his daughter, who was now its queen, and hoping, she understood immediately, to renegotiate whatever terms he imagined still existed between them. She received him in the small, formal reception room, which was deliberate. Not the private sitting room, not the library, not any space she actually inhabited. Neutral ground, formal, with a guard at the door. He looked older. He looked reduced, in the specific way of people whose social architecture has collapsed and left them without the scaffolding they'd been mistaking for themselves. He looked at her face, uncovered, directly, the face he'd been hiding for 14 years, with an expression she recognized as the beginning of sentiment, the preparation for some version of "I was trying to protect you," the story people tell themselves about the harm they've done when they want to reconstruct it as care. She let him sit down. "Leora," he started. "I know about the consortium," she said. He stopped. "I know about the land sales," she said. "I know what your family received from the individuals who organized the Veldmoor attack. I know that the seal you had placed on me was not to protect me from the world, but to protect your silence from me." She kept her voice level, factual, the way she kept everything that mattered. "I know all of it." He was very still. "I'm not going to prosecute you," she said. "The evidence of direct personal involvement isn't sufficient, and frankly, your family gained their portion of the consortium's proceeds 3 generations ago and spent it 2 generations ago. There's nothing left to recover that would justify the process." She looked at him. "But I want you to understand something." He waited. "The mark on my hand," she said. "You told me it was a curse. You told me I was dangerous and broken and something to be hidden and sold and ultimately disappeared." She held his gaze without anger. Anger would have given him something to respond to, some role to play in the scene, and she was not interested in giving him a role. "You were wrong. It was mine. It was what I was born to be, and you spent 14 years trying to bury it because it was inconvenient for you." He opened his mouth. "I don't need anything from you," she said. "Not an apology, not an explanation. Nothing." She stood. "I have a kingdom to run, and a legal framework to implement, and a council to rebuild, and I've taken 20 minutes out of a significant day to tell you that I know the truth, and that the truth is on the record now, and that what you did to me and what was done before you are now part of the official history of these territories." She looked at him steadily. "You can go." He stood. He looked at her face one more time, the face he'd hidden, the mark on her hand that was luminous in the morning light, and she watched him arrive, finally, at an honest accounting of what he'd done, and find it as insufficient as she'd always known it would be. He left. She stood at the window and breathed for a moment. Then she went back to work. Spring came to the northern frontier the way spring always came, reluctantly after long negotiation with the winter, giving ground inch by inch until suddenly the mountain snow was running in the passes and the graywood timber routes were opening and the first merchant caravans of the year were moving north through passes that, for the first time in living memory, were being maintained by enchanters licensed under the new framework. The enchantment work was careful, modest, nothing like the old days. The practitioners emerging from decades of concealment were not a workforce ready to deploy at full capacity. They were individuals, cautious, many of them old, who had been hiding what they were for so long that the hiding had become structural. Leora understood this completely. She made a point of meeting each one personally when they came to register for licensing, which was not required by the framework, but which she did anyway, because she understood that the people most likely to doubt the sincerity of a changed system were the ones the previous system had harmed most directly. She sat across tables from weather workers in their 70s who had not practiced in 40 years, and who cried briefly when she told them the licenses were real. She met preservation specialists who'd been running their operations undercover as herbalists and were braced for punishment when they arrived for registration and received paperwork instead. She met a structural enchanter from the Asheville region who was 23 years old and had been practicing in secret since he was 15 and had never told another person what he was. And she looked at him across the table, young, scared, holding his own version of a coal in a fist, and she said, "You're safe here. This is real." He looked at her marked hand on the table between them. "They said you broke a 200-year curse," he said. "I did," she said. "How?" She thought about it for a moment. I understood its structure, she said, and I had the right kind of fire. He nodded slowly. He signed the paperwork. He left the palace upright, with his papers in hand, and she watched him go and felt the particular satisfaction of work that is both large and exact, that addresses the real thing, not a comfortable approximation of it. 1. The day Leora gave birth to their son, the first snow of the following winter was falling outside the palace windows. He arrived in the early afternoon, which was practical of him. Kael said this, and she told him that was an inappropriate thing to say about a newborn, and then laughed anyway, because she was exhausted and relieved, and the room was warm, and the fire in the grate and the fire in her were both steady, and the man sitting beside her on the edge of the bed was holding his son for the first time with the specific, careful wonder of someone who has never been uncertain about very much encountering something entirely beyond certainty's jurisdiction. The baby had dark hair. He had his father's eyes, and when he opened his hand and curled it around Leora's finger, she looked at the unmarked back of his small hand with the particular attention she gave things she needed to know for certain. Unmarked. The curse was gone from the line entirely. She had suspected this from the mechanism of how she'd broken it, not just halting its activation, but dismantling its architecture, removing the constructed element from the Draven bloodline's natural substrate. But suspecting was different from knowing, and knowing produced a feeling she sat with for a long moment. In the quiet of the room, with the snow falling outside and her husband beside her and their son in his arms, every king of the Draven line going forward was free. Not from the natural vulnerability, that was biology, not construction, and biology was not hers to change, but free from the engineered certainty that love must cost everything, free to love without a structure waiting to punish them for it. This was, she thought, the most permanent thing she had ever done. "What do we name him?" Kael said quietly, looking at his son with the undefended expression that was simply him now, fully present, the warmth of him undisguised. She looked at the baby. She thought about names, what they meant, what they carried, what they built into a person from the beginning. She had never liked her own name much. It had been given before her father understood what she was, and it had always felt like a label applied to a problem rather than a word chosen for a person. "Something that means what he is," she said. "Not what we hope he'll be. What he already is right now." "Which is?" She looked at him, at the small, perfect face, the dark hair, the hand wrapped around her finger with complete trust. "Free," she said. "Unencumbered. Beginning." Kael thought about it for a moment. "Calder," he said. "In the old frontier language, it means the waters that run from the first thaw." She tested it quietly. "Calder Draven." "The beginning of the thaw," he said. She looked at her husband. He was looking back at her with the full warmth of him, the open, undefended face she'd spent 4 months watching come into the open and was now simply what she came home to. And she thought about the auction hall, the cold and the torchlight, and the 31 empty seats. And the distance between that morning and this afternoon was the whole length of herself, every decision and every refusal and every coal held in a fist until the right moment to let it become what it had always been. "Calder," she said. 6 months later, Kael stood before the full assembly of Northern Pack Lords. Every territory, every senior lord, every member of the newly constituted council, at the annual Frontier Summit. It was the first summit held under the new magical practice framework, the first with licensed enchanters present as credentialed participants rather than hidden practitioners. The first with the Greywood, Ashvale, and Thornfield delegations seated as compact partners rather than restless potential defectors. He was supposed to give the standard address, says the formal opening, the territorial review, the economic summary. He gave those. And then, at the end, he stepped away from the prepared text. "When I came to the Veldmoor auction 18 months ago," he said, "I made a decision that this court and this assembly did not understand. I chose a woman no one wanted. A woman with a restricted file and a hidden face and rumors attached to her name that most of this room took as warning rather than description." He looked across the assembled hall, at Brennan, who was already nodding, at the new council members who were listening, at Corvin, who had the expression of a man whose anxiety has found something more useful to do than just be anxious. I made that decision for reasons I didn't entirely understand at the time. I understood the quality of her attention, the quality of her mind, the particular refusal in the way she held herself in a room designed to take everything from her. The hall was quiet. What I understand now, he said, is that the woman I chose by the only honest instinct I'd acted on in 9 years of very careful kingship was not just competent or useful or strategically valuable. She was the thing this kingdom needed that no policy or treaty or military campaign could provide. He paused. She looked at 40 years of manufactured fear and decided to understand it rather than accept it. She looked at a curse that had killed 2 kings and decided to dismantle it rather than avoid it. She looked at a hall full of people who didn't want her and chose to walk into it anyway, and she has not stopped walking forward since. He looked toward the place where she was seated, and she looked back at him, and the room looked at both of them. The Northern Territories has had many queens, he said. Most of them understood their role as the management of proximity to power. Leora Draven does not manage proximity. She generates it. He held her gaze across the room. She is the most powerful person in this kingdom and the greatest strength of this crown, and I want every pack lord and every territory and every person in the northern frontier to know it in exactly those terms. The hall was still for a moment. Then Brennan started it. The old frontier acknowledgement, both hands flat on the table, a resonant thud of affirmation. The Greywood delegation joined him, the Ashvale contingent, the Thornfield. One by one, table by table, the sound spread through the room until the hall was full of it, the deep collective drumming of 100 pairs of hands saying, "We see you, we know you, we acknowledge what you are." Leora sat in it. She did not perform composure. She did not hold herself together in the way she'd held herself together through 6 years of small rooms and auction halls and council meetings and confrontations and nights when the seal pressed against the inside of her with nowhere to go. She let the sound of it move through her the way she'd let the fear move through her in the room after the curse broke, fully, honestly, because it was real and it was hers and she had earned it. Her marked hand was open on the table in front of her. The fire in it was steady and warm and entirely at rest. Outside the summit hall, the mountain stood against the sky, and the winter trade routes were open for the first season in 4 decades. And somewhere in the palace, a small boy with his father's eyes was being introduced to the library by Marin, who had decided he was old enough to be shown where the interesting books were, which was a decision Leora had approved and Kyle had said would result in a child who never stopped asking questions. She had told him that was the best possible outcome. And the woman who had once been the most unmarketable candidate in a Veldmoor auction hall, the woman who had been told since before she could form complete sentences that she was a problem to be managed, a liability to be contained, a thing to be hidden and eventually sold. That woman sat in the center of the hall that had been built to take everything from people like her, with the fire of who she was burning warm and unconcerned in her open hand, and she let herself be seen. Completely. Finally. For the very first time.